There are beings in Elden Ring so ancient and so vast that the game never even shows them to you, and today we're going to sit down and go through every single one of them. What they are, what they want, and why they matter to the world you spent hundreds of hours walking through. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So, a little bit about why I made this video. I have always been drawn to the parts of Elden Ring that the game refuses to explain outright. The Outer Gods are probably the best example of that. They are everywhere in the lore. Every major faction, every demigod, every catastrophe in the game's history traces back to one of them in some way. But the game gives you their influence in fragments, scattered across item descriptions, NPC dialogue, and environmental detail. What I wanted to do here was pull all of that together into something that actually flows. One thing I chose to do when assembling this was to lead with the Elden Beast and work outward from there, because I think understanding the one outer god the game does show you makes everything else click into place. I also chose to leave out extended speculation about gods that have almost no textual support, because I wanted this to stay grounded in what the game actually suggests, rather than drift too far into fan theory territory. Everything you are going to hear tonight is my interpretation of the lore as I understand it. Where the game is ambiguous, I will say so. Where something points clearly in one direction, I will say that too. Alright, let us get into it. The Elden Beast. To understand what an outer god is in the world of Elden Ring, you first have to understand the one that the game actually puts in front of you. At the very end of your journey, past Marika, past the Elden Ring itself, past everything the Erd tree stands for, you fight the Elden Beast. And what is it? The game describes it as a golden beast from the outer skies, a heavenly emissary that was sent to the lands between, from somewhere beyond the known world. It carried with it the Elden Ring, this perfect foundational law that would govern all life, all death, all growth in the world it landed in. The Elden Beast is not a god in the way we usually think of gods. It is more like a vessel or a messenger, or possibly both at the same time. The item description for the Elden Ring itself suggests that this golden order was not invented by any being native to the lands between. It came from somewhere else, something sent it. And the Elden Beast appears to be either that something, or at least the physical form that something took when it arrived. One reading of this is that the Elden Beast is entirely obedient, a tool of a higher cosmic will that we never get to see. Another reading is that the Elden Beast has its own motivations, its own sense of self-preservation, and that it fights you at the end not because it is following orders, but because it genuinely does not want to be replaced or destroyed. The fact that it retreats, that it tries to heal, that it seems almost afraid points towards something that has more interiority than a simple weapon would. What the Elden Beast establishes for us is the basic model for how outer gods work in this world. They exist outside the lands between. They exert influence over it, sometimes directly through a chosen vessel, sometimes more subtly. They each carry with them a kind of order, a set of laws or forces that they want to impose on the world. And they are in competition with each other, whether that competition is active and violent or slow and ideological. With that foundation in place, we can start looking at the others. The Formless Mother. The Formless Mother is one of the outer gods that the game describes most explicitly, and also one of the most unsettling. She is the god of blood. Not blood in a clean or symbolic sense, but blood as a physical, visceral, almost sacred substance. The Formless Mother has a relationship with blood that suggests obsession, that suggests she finds something in it that other forces do not. Her primary mortal connection is Mork, Lord of Blood, one of the demigod children of Marika and Godfrey. Moog was born with the Omen curse, which in the lands between is a mark of disfigurement and shame. Omen children are typically sealed away underground or killed outright, Morg and his twin brother Morgott were imprisoned beneath Leyndell in the sewers, and it was down there in the dark that the Formless Mother found Morg. The lore around Morg suggests that she appeared to him in dreams first. She offered him something he had never had, which was power, recognition, a sense of destiny. The Bloodlord's exaltation talisman describes her as having bestowed upon Morg her blood, her fury, her rancour. There is a quality to that description that feels almost maternal, almost tender, which makes it more disturbing rather than less. She did not simply empower Morg. The lore points toward a relationship that had emotional texture to it, that Morg genuinely loved her in some way, and that this love shaped everything he became. Morg eventually escaped the sewers, built his own dynasty in the Mogwyn Palace hidden beneath a crimson lake of blood, and devoted himself entirely to her worship. His plan, as far as the lore suggests, was to become a god himself, to elevate himself and eventually Miquella to divine status through the Formless Mother's blessing. The blood ritual he performs on Miquella's body in the Mogwyn Palace is the centerpiece of that ambition. He believed that if he could make Miquella his consort, that together they could found a new dynasty under the Formless Mother's blessing. What is the Formless Mother herself, beyond what she represents? The game does not give us her origin. She is described as formless, which suggests she either has no fixed physical shape or that her true nature is something that cannot be perceived directly. She communicates through blood, through hemorrhage, through the eruption of blood from the body in ways that should be fatal but are not. The blood boon miracle, which calls down droplets of her blood from above, implies that she can reach into the lands between and offer pieces of herself as gifts or weapons. One possible reading is that the Formless Mother is a god of sacrifice. That blood in her framework is the most real and most sacred thing a mortal body contains, and that spilling it willingly is an act of devotion. The way her followers use blood in combat, not just as a weapon, but as something almost ceremonial, supports that reading. Another possible reading is that she is simply a hungry thing, ancient and enormous, and that the theology her worshippers have built around her is a story they told themselves to make the hunger feel meaningful. The Fell God is the deity of the fire giants, and it is one of the outer gods that the game talks about mostly in historical terms, rather than as an active present force. By the time you walk through the world of Elden Ring, the fire giants are almost extinct. There is only one left, the last of his kind, chained at the mountaintop of the giants, to guard the forge of the giants for all eternity. But once the fire giants were a civilization, and they had a god. The Fell God is described as a god of rot and ruin, of fire in the destructive sense, fire that consumes rather than warms. The flame of the Fell God incantation, which the last fire giant drops when you kill him, gives us the clearest description. It calls down a massive ball of fire that rolls and spreads, and its description says it contains the fire of the Fell God, a raging conflagration imbued with the deity's fury. The history here, as the lore suggests it, is that the fire giants were once a powerful people native to the lands between, or at least to the mountainous northern regions of it. They served their god, and in doing so they maintained the Forge of the Giants, a massive furnace capable of burning the Erdtree itself. Queen Marika, when she was consolidating power and establishing the Golden Order, could not allow that to stand. A weapon capable of destroying her god's vessel, her god's symbol, the literal tree that defined all life and death in her world, was an existential threat. So Marika waged war on the fire giants. She sent Godfrey, her husband, and the first Elden Lord to conquer them. The war was brutal. It ended with the near-total destruction of the fire giant civilization, with only one survivor left alive, deliberately, so that someone would still be around to light the forge if Marika ever needed it. The fire giants had their tendons cut and were bound by gold, a kind of theological humiliation on top of a physical one. But here is the detail that makes this more interesting. Marika, the lore suggests, wanted to destroy the fell god. She wanted to kill it. And there are readings of the lore that suggest she may have partially succeeded, or at least wounded it, imprisoned it somehow, within the forge itself. The Forge of the Giants is described as containing the fire from the age of the fell god, which points toward the possibility that the god itself is in there somehow, that the fire is not just a tool, but a remnant of a divine presence. If that reading is correct, then Marika effectively imprisoned a god inside a furnace and left one broken giant to guard it forever. That changes the emotional register of the entire mountaintop area. That last fire giant is not just a remnant of a lost people. He is a jailer, and also, perhaps, a mourner. The Scarlet Rot and the God of Rot. This is where things get layered, because the Scarlet Rot is one of the most visible forces in the game. Malenia is one of the most famous characters in Elden Ring, and yet the exact nature of the god behind the rot is never stated plainly. What the game gives us instead is a series of descriptions and implications that point towards something enormous and alien. The Scarlet Rot is not just a disease. The lore is pretty clear that it is a fundamentally different order of existence, an alternative to the Golden Order's framework. Where the Golden Order organizes life, death, and rebirth in a particular pattern, the rot suggests a different pattern entirely, one built on decay, transformation, and a kind of horrifying abundance. Things rotted by the Scarlet Rot do not simply die, they become part of something else. They are incorporated into a spreading ecology of fungal and rot-based life that replaces what came before. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, was born with the Scarlet Rot inside her. She never asked for it. She has been fighting it her entire life, and she has never been able to stop it entirely. The lore around her suggests that she is a vessel for the God of Rot, not a willing one, not a chosen one in any triumphant sense, but a container that the god's influence inhabits, whether she wants it or not. When she blooms, when the rot fully erupts from her in battle, she is described as becoming something closer to that divine force, a flower of death and decay. The connection that makes this particularly interesting is Miquella. Miquella spent his life trying to cure Malenia. He was arguably the most gifted demigod in terms of raw magical talent, and the single project he devoted most of his energy to was finding a way to free his sister from the rot inside her. The Halig tree, his golden tree that he grew from his own golden needle, was partly intended as a place where Malenia might be free. It did not work. The rot came there too. Some readings of the lore suggest that there is a direct opposition between Miquella's god and Malenia's rot. Miquella has affiliations with the concept of order, growth, and eventually with a kind of forced love or compulsion through his Empyrean nature. The rot god, by contrast, represents something that cannot be ordered, cannot be controlled, and certainly cannot be cured by golden needles. Where does the god of rot actually exist? The swamp of Aeonia, where Malenia and Radahn fought their final battle, and where Malenia bloomed for the first time, is the most obvious physical site of the rot's presence in the world. But the Lake of Rot in Noxtella, far underground, suggests that the rot has deep roots in the lands between that predate Malenia entirely. It was already there, underground, ancient, patient. One reading that has some support in the lore is that the god of Rot and Astel, which we will get to, are connected. That the rot came from the stars, or at least from outside the known world. Another reading keeps the rot as its own indigenous force, a rival cosmic order that the Golden Order has been suppressing or competing with for as long as the Erd Tree has existed. The Frenzied Flame and the Lord of Chaos. This is the one that feels the most like a direct ideological counterpoint to everything the Golden Order stands for. The Frenzied Flame is described in the game as the Flame of Chaos, and its origins are placed outside the lands between, as with the other outer gods. But what makes it distinctive is what it wants. Every other outer god we have looked at has some kind of ordered agenda. The Elden Beast wants the Golden Order maintained. The Formless Mother wants blood and devotion. The Rot, arguably, wants to spread and transform. The Frenzied Flame, as the lore presents it, wants an end to all of that. Not a different order, not a replacement system, a return to the chaos that preceded all order, all separation, all individuation. The three fingers are the physical manifestation of this god's presence in the lands between, a deliberate parallel to the two fingers who serve the Elden Beast. Where the two fingers gesture toward the Golden Order and beckon you toward becoming Elden Lord, the three fingers offer the flame of frenzy and the prospect of becoming the Lord of Chaos, the person who lights the Erd tree and burns everything back to nothing. Hieta is the NPC most closely associated with this path. She is almost entirely blind, and as you give her the shabriri grapes she asks for, she gradually moves toward her own communion with the three fingers. Her questline ends with her achieving something she calls sight, the ability to perceive a distant light that she believes is beautiful, which the lore suggests is the Frenzied Flame itself. She becomes a finger maiden to the Lord of Chaos, a guide for someone who will end everything. Shabriri is the other key figure here. He appears to be a spirit or influence capable of possessing the recently deceased, and he is described as having the most hated and accursed name in all the lands between. He speaks for the Frenzied Flame with enthusiasm, perhaps too much enthusiasm, in a way that suggests he genuinely believes in it rather than simply serving it out of obligation. The shabriri grape, the thing Hieta eats, is described as an eye that has been stained by madness, an eye that points toward the Frenzied Flame. The frenzy itself, as a force, operates on people through their eyes. Every frenzy spell either comes from the eyes or targets the eyes. The message of the Frenzied Flame seems to be that vision, the ability to perceive the world as divided into separate things with separate identities, is the source of suffering. Take away vision, take away the distinctions, burn it all back to a unified, undifferentiated nothing, and the suffering ends. Whether that is a liberation or an annihilation depends entirely on how you look at it, and the game is quite deliberate about not telling you which interpretation is correct. Shabriri argues for liberation. The way every NPC reacts to the Frenzied Flame suggests annihilation. The truth, as the lore points toward it, is probably that it is both, and that the distinction does not matter to the entity driving the agenda. The Elden Beast and the Greater Will. We talked about the Elden Beast earlier, but to fully understand it we need to talk about the Greater Will, because these two things are related but may not be the same. The Greater Will is the term used for the highest divine authority behind the Golden Order. It is the force that sent the Elden Ring to the lands between. It is what the two fingers speak for. It is what Marika served and what the Erd tree embodies. But is the Greater Will and the Elden Beast the same being? The lore suggests probably not, or at least not simply. The Elden Beast is described as an emissary, a thing sent by the Greater Will, which implies that the Greater Will is something else, something that remained behind, something that exists at a level even further removed from the lands between than the Elden Beast. The Elden Beast is the presence, the Greater Will is the source. What is the Greater Will then? The game does not say directly. The two fingers, which are physical manifestations of its will, communicate through finger-reading prophets, called finger readers, and they give instructions and endorse particular candidates for Elden Lord. But they do not explain their master's nature, probably because they either cannot or are not permitted to. One reading that has some traction is that the Greater Will is itself one outer god, among several, the most powerful or most established of them, the one that successfully colonized the lands between first and set up the Golden Order as its particular regime of control. Under this reading, the war between different outer gods, the Frenzied Flame, the Rot, the Blood, is partly a territorial conflict, a competition for dominance over a world that one cosmic power has claimed and others want. Another reading is that the greater will is something closer to a fundamental cosmic law, something like an anthropomorphized universe, and that the other outer gods are aberrations or rebels against it rather than competitors of equal standing. Under this reading, the Elden Beast is something like a herald or angel, and the world of Elden Ring is a place where a divine order is trying to hold together against forces of entropy and chaos. The two fingers themselves are interesting artifacts of this relationship. They are described as having withered at some point, as having gone silent. Something broke the communication between the greater will and its representatives in the lands between. Some readings connect this to Marika's shattering of the Elden Ring, which was itself an act of defiance or desperation that the lore points toward as possibly motivated by grief over the death of her son Godwyn. If Marika broke the Elden Ring deliberately, she was acting against the greater will's order. What does it mean that a god's chosen vessel rebelled against the god? That question sits at the heart of everything in Elden Ring, and the outer god's framework is what makes it feel cosmically significant rather than just politically messy. The stars and the outer gods beyond the sky. There is a category of cosmic influence in Elden Ring that is easy to miss because it is embedded in the game's astronomy rather than in its theology. Several items and spells reference the stars as a source of power, and the implication of several lore descriptions is that the stars themselves, or things inside them or beyond them, represent a form of divine presence. Astel, natural born of the void, is probably the clearest example. Astel is described as a meteorite that fell from the outer skies and brought with it the power to erase entire peoples from existence. It destroyed the eternal cities, the underground civilization of the Nox people, by falling into their realm and annihilating them. The lore describes this as a heavenly punishment, though who ordered the punishment and why is left ambiguous. Astel is not explicitly named as a god in the lore, but it is named as being from the void beyond, and its abilities include removing the sky from an area entirely, which the Nox underground cities lack because Astel took it from them. That is not the power of a simple meteorite. That points towards something that is either a god itself or a weapon wielded by something godlike. The Nox people, for their part, are described as having reached for the stars themselves. They built underground cities and developed their own astronomical magic, and the implied story is that their ambition, their attempt to build a path to the outer skies, is what brought Astel down on them. Whether that is cause and effect or coincidence, the lore does not say definitively. But the parallel to hubris myths, to stories where mortals who reach too high get knocked down, is hard to miss. There is another celestial figure worth mentioning here, and that is the baleful shadow and its relationship to Miquella's abduction. Mohg took Miquella's body, but before Miquella was taken, his needle was removed, which left him vulnerable to outside influence. Some readings of the lore suggest that Miquella, once freed from the needle's protection, became susceptible to a different outer god's influence, one connected to the stars or to the void, one that pulled him toward a different kind of destiny than the one he'd been working toward. This is speculative territory, and I want to be clear about that, but it is one of the more interesting threads in the lore, because it suggests that even the most powerful demigod in the game, even someone who successfully escaped Mohg's ritual in some sense, was not free from divine manipulation. He may have just walked out of one god's trap and into another's. The Gloam-eyed Queen and the Goddess of Death. This is where the lore gets into what might be one of the most significant events in the history of the lands between, and also one of the most obscure. The Rune of Death, which is one of the fundamental components of the Elden Ring, was removed from it by Marika at some point before the game's events. She locked it away, and in doing so, she changed the nature of death in the world. Before Marika locked away the rune of death, people died in the conventional sense, meaning they stopped existing in their current form and were presumably processed through whatever afterlife or recycling system the Greater Will's order provided. After she locked it away, people stopped dying permanently. They could be killed, but their souls would return to the Erdtree and eventually be reborn. Death became something that the Golden Order could manage, control, and revoke. The Glowmide Queen was associated with destined death, which is the power of true, permanent, irreversible death, the kind that existed before Marika altered the Elden Ring. She was an Empyrean, which means she was a candidate to become a god, and she wielded godskin apostles who could kill even gods permanently. Malekith, Marika's Black Blade, defeated her in battle and sealed destined death away. Here is where it gets interesting. Was the Glowmide Queen serving an outer god of death? The lore does not name such a god explicitly, but the existence of destined death as a discrete force, the existence of the Rune of Death as something that could be removed from the Elden Ring, and the existence of an entire order of death-dealing warriors devoted to the Glowmide Queen all point toward the possibility that there is a god of death somewhere in the background of all this. Fia, the deathbed companion, is another data point here. She collects the death root that grows from Godwyn's corpse, and she's working towards something she calls the Age of Duskborn, in which all souls would be freed from the Erdtree system of recycling and allowed to die truly and finally. She believes this is a mercy. She calls the Erdtree system a kind of imprisonment where souls are held and recycled against their nature. Whether Fia is serving an outer god, or whether she is acting on her own interpretation of what justice looks like, the lore leaves open. But the crucible of death that she creates inside Godwyn's rot suggests that Deathroot is not just a plant, but a physical manifestation of something divine leaking through the wound in the world that Godwyn's killing created. Godwyn the Golden was killed by the Rune of Death, while his soul was already at peace, meaning only his body died while his soul survived. The result was an undead body that kept growing, kept putrefying, kept spreading Deathroot through the earth. If the Glowmide Queen's god is the god of death, then Godwyn's death, this half-death that violated the Rune of Death's proper function, may have been a catastrophe not just for the world, but for that god's domain, the god of rot, Miquella, and the question of new gods. Before we go any further, it is worth pausing on something the game makes clear, but that is easy to underestimate. Empyreans are not just powerful people. They are candidates to replace Marika, to become the next vessel of a god, to become a god themselves. The outer gods are not simply an eternal fixed council. They can acquire new vessels, new representatives, new presences in the world. Miquella is the clearest example of this. He is described as the most fearsome Empyrean in the game, more capable than Melania, more dangerous than Rani, and the final DLC content points very strongly toward Miquella having made contact with a different god entirely, or possibly having decided to become a god independent of any outer god's sponsorship. The nature of Miquella's specific divine affiliation in the late lore is one of the more contested areas of the fandom, and I do not want to overstate what the game directly says. What it does suggest is that Miquella's plan after escaping Mohg involved shedding his love for others, casting it away as something that would compromise him, and pursuing a kind of cold divine ambition. Whether that ambition involves serving an existing outer god or becoming one in some new way is something the lore points toward, rather than stating outright. Rani, by contrast, is an Empyrean who explicitly rejected the path laid out for her. She killed her own body before any god could claim her as a vessel, and she has been working ever since toward an age she calls the Age of Stars, in which the moon and stars would guide the world without any outer god's direct control. Her ending is perhaps the most interesting theologically, because it suggests that the outer god's monopoly on divine order is not necessarily permanent, that a sufficiently powerful and determined Empyrean might be able to create something new. The outer gods, if Rani's framework is right, are not omnipotent. They need vessels, they need worshippers, they need footholds in the world. Take those things away, and their power in that world diminishes. Rani's plan, in her own words, involves a cold, dark moon that grants order without domination, guidance without control. Whether that is achievable, or just a beautiful idea, is something the game does not resolve, because all the endings in Elden Ring are presented as beginnings of eras, rather than conclusions of stories. The Crucible and the Golden Order's suppressed past. This is not an outer god in the conventional sense, but it is relevant to understanding the full picture. The Crucible is described as the primordial form of the Erd Tree, the raw generative force that existed before the Golden Order imposed its particular laws on life and death. Before the Erd Tree, life was more fluid. The Crucible law suggests that bodies and forms were less fixed, that creatures could have aspects of other creatures, tails and wings and gills mixed in with human shapes. The Golden Order, when it established itself, pushed all of that aside. The Erd Tree's order is clean and sorted and hierarchical. The Crucible's order is messy and generative and indifferent to boundaries. Crucible Knights are warriors who fought for Godfrey in the age before the Erd Tree fully took hold, and they still carry traces of the Crucible in their armour and abilities. Why does this matter for the outer gods? Because it suggests that the Golden Order, the Elden Beasts regime, was not simply filling a vacuum when it arrived. It was replacing something. It imposed itself over a pre-existing sacred order and marginalized or suppressed that older power. The Crucible may be a god, or maybe the residue of one, or maybe something that was on its way to becoming a god before the Elden Beast arrived and interrupted the process. One reading of this is that the entire history of the lands between is a story of colonization, that the Greater Will and the Elden Beast arrived from outside, found a world with its own sacred forces, and overwrote them with a different system. The Fire Giants, the Nox, the creatures of the Crucible Age, the Gloam-eyed Queen's Order, all of these might represent things that existed before or outside the Golden Order, and were suppressed or destroyed as the Elden Beast's regime consolidated control. That reading makes the player's journey, and all the endings, feel different. You are not just choosing between different cosmic rulers. You are choosing what kind of history gets remembered, and whose order gets to define what comes next. The mysterious force behind the Black Knife assassination. The Black Knife assassination is one of the pivotal events in Elden Ring's backstory. On a night that the lore calls the Night of the Black Knives, someone killed Godwyn the Golden using a stolen fragment of the Rune of Death. This kicked off the sequence of events that led to the shattering, to the breaking of the Elden Ring, to everything you encounter in the game. The assassins were the Black Knife Assassins, a group of warrior maidens connected to Rani. Rani orchestrated the theft of the Rune of Death and used it to kill her own body at the same moment Godwyn was killed, severing her connection to the Greater Will's plan for her, and beginning her long project of operating as a soul without a physical form. But who gave Rani the idea? Where did she get the knowledge to do this? The lore suggests she had help, and some descriptions point toward an entity or force beyond Rani herself. Whether that entity is an outer god, or simply an ancient intelligence within the lands between, is genuinely unclear. What is clearer is the effect. The Night of the Black Knives was the event that broke the stability of the Golden Order. It destabilized Marika to the point where she eventually shattered the Elden Ring herself. Whether Rani intended this fully, or whether the consequences spiraled beyond her control, is something the lore leaves open. The Outer God framework makes the Black Knife assassination feel like a chess move in a game being played at a scale beyond individual characters. Rani wanted freedom from the greater will. Someone, something, may have wanted the Golden Order destabilized. These goals aligned, and the result was a night that changed everything. The moon and Rani's patron Rani is associated with the moon. Her magic is lunar. Her agenda involves the stars leading the world forward, and there is a consistent reading of the law that suggests she has her own divine patron, separate from the greater will, that guided or assisted her in her project of becoming independent. The dark moon is mentioned in several item descriptions. It is a different moon than the one that simply hangs in the sky. It is described as a cold presence, as something ancient, as a source of power that predates or exists outside the Golden Order. Some readings suggest it is an outer god itself, a celestial divine presence that wants something like what Rani wants, freedom from the greater will's dominion. If this reading is correct, then Rani is not as independent as she presents herself. She has traded one god's patronage for another's, perhaps a kinder or more aligned one, but still not truly free. Her ending, the Age of Stars, might be the Dark Moon's age as much as it is Rani's. Alternatively, the moon's power might be something Rani has claimed for herself, a force without a god behind it, or a god so distant and indifferent that Rani can use its power without being controlled by it. The difference matters philosophically, but the game does not resolve it. What the lunar imagery around Rani does is suggest that the stars and celestial bodies in Elden Ring are not simply background scenery. They are meaningful. They have divine weight. The Elden Beast came from the stars. Astal came from the stars. Rani's power comes from the moon and stars. The underground civilizations of the Nox were destroyed for reaching toward the stars. There is something up there in the outer skies beyond the lands between that the game keeps pointing at without quite letting you see. Putting it together. When you lay all of these forces out alongside each other, what emerges is less a hierarchy and more an ecology. The greater will and the Elden Beast represent one kind of cosmic order, the dominant one, the one that currently controls the lands between. But it is surrounded by rival orders, each one representing a different set of laws about what life, death, power, and existence should look like. The Formless Mother wants blood to be sacred. The god of rot wants decay to be the dominant form of change. The fell god wanted fire to be the fundamental force of the world. The Frenzied Flame wants all distinctions dissolved back into unity. The dark moon, if it is a god, wants something like Rani's vision of cold freedom. The god of death, if it exists, wants the cycle of dying to mean something permanent and real. Marika was in the middle of all of this. She served the greater will. She built the Golden Order. She suppressed the fell god and the gloam-eyed queen and the crucible. But she also, at some point, broke. She shattered the Elden Ring. She let in chaos. Whether that was grief or rebellion or madness or all three, the law does not say with certainty. And now you, the Tarnished, walk through the wreckage of all of that. Every grace site is a remnant of the greater will's infrastructure. Every rot swamp is evidence of a rival god's territory. Every blood boon is the Formless Mother's fingers, still reaching into the world. Every frenzied flame evangelist is someone who decided the chaos was preferable to the order. The outer gods are not plot devices. They are the architecture of the world. They are the reason everything is the way it is. The war between them is not happening in cutscenes or boss fights. It is happening in the landscape, in the item descriptions, in the way certain places smell, and certain spells behave, and certain NPCs talk about the sky with fear or longing. That is what I wanted to show with this video. Not just a list of gods and their powers, but the feeling of a world where multiple enormous forces are competing for the same real estate, and every person and creature in that world is caught in the crossfire, whether they know it or not. The Elden Beast did not build the lands between. It claimed it. And the question that every ending in Elden Ring is really asking is, what happens to a world after the thing that claimed it is gone? You said, continue, continue 2243. Claude responded, the age of the Erd tree and what came before. The age of the Erd tree and what came before. To really understand the weight of what the outer gods have done to the lands between, you have to try to imagine what the world looked like before the Erd tree, before the golden light, before the Elden Ring was embedded in the earth and its laws began shaping every living thing. The game does not show you this age directly, but it leaves traces of it everywhere, in the architecture of ruined places, in the abilities of ancient enemies, in the way certain creatures move and behave as though they belong to a different biological logic than everything else in the world. The Crucible Age, as we touched on earlier, was a time when life did not have fixed boundaries. The lore around Crucible Knight enemies describes them as warriors from the early age of the Erd Tree, which implies that even the earliest Erd Tree period was already a step away from something older. Before the Erd Tree, life borrowed freely from itself. A person might have a tail. A beast might have gill-like structures. The physical form was more of a suggestion than a rule. What ended that? The simplest answer the lore gives is the Erd Tree itself, or more precisely, the laws encoded in the Elden Ring that the Erd Tree embodies. When the Greater Will's order took hold, it drew lines. This is a person. This is a beast. This is what a person can and cannot be. This is what growth looks like and what it does not. The Crucible did not disappear entirely. You can still access its incantations. You can still find enemies and bosses that carry its aspects, but it was pushed to the margins, treated as a primitive or dangerous thing. This suppression of what came before is one of the recurring patterns in Elden Ring's history, and understanding it helps explain why the outer gods, outside the Greater Will's order, keep finding purchase in the world. They are not always introducing something new. Sometimes they are reawakening something old, something that was here before the Golden Order arrived, and that never entirely left. The Numen and Marika's origin. Marika is not native to the lands between in the way that most of its inhabitants are. She is described as being of the Numen, a race described as being from the outer skies, not from another country or another region, but from somewhere genuinely beyond, from outside the world entirely. She came to the lands between from elsewhere. This is one of the most quietly significant pieces of lore in the entire game, and it tends to get overshadowed by everything else. If Marika is from outside the world, then the person who became the vessel of the Greater Will, who remade the lands between in the Greater Will's image, was herself an outsider. She did not serve the Greater Will on behalf of the lands between. She served it as someone who came from the same direction the Elden Beast did, from the outer skies, from beyond the world. What does that mean for the people of the lands between? The fire giants, the crucible creatures, the Nox underground civilizations, all of them were here before Marika. She arrived as part of a project. The Greater Will sent the Elden Ring, sent the Elden Beast as its vessel, and also had Marika, a Numen woman from the outer skies, positioned to become the god's human representative. Whether Marika came willingly, whether she understood what she was becoming part of, the lore does not say. But the shape of it suggests something like a coordinated effort. The Greater Will did not simply drop the Elden Ring into a world and walk away. It had a person in place to become that world's god, to administer its order, to make children who would become demigods and spread the Golden Order's influence across the land. The whole Erd Tree civilization is under this reading a colony of the Greater Will, and Marika is its appointed governor, which makes her shattering of the Elden Ring all the more seismic, not just as a personal act of grief or rebellion, as an act of defiance against the entity that recruited her, or created her, or sent her here with a purpose she eventually refused to fulfill. Godfrey and the dispossession of the tarnished Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, is another piece of the puzzle that reveals how deliberately The greater will shaped the world. Godfrey was a great warrior, Marika's husband, the man who led the conquest of the fire giants and established the Golden Order's military supremacy. And then he was exiled. When Godfrey had completed his purpose, when the wars were won and the order was established, the greater will stripped him of his grace. Grace is the divine light that guides the tarnished, that connects them to the Erdtree's order. Losing it meant Godfrey was no longer part of that system. He became the first tarnished, exiled from the lands between along with his warriors, cast out beyond the fog, with his purpose served and his usefulness apparently ended. The law around this suggests that Godfrey's exile was not a punishment in the punitive sense. It was a demotion from utility. The greater will used him, and when it no longer needed him in that role, it discarded him. And then later, when the Elden Ring was shattered and chaos threatened, it recalled him, recalled all the tarnished, as a reserve force to deal with the emergency. You, the player character, are one of those tarnished. You are the descendant of people who were used and discarded and then called back when convenient. The entire premise of the game, your journey back to the lands between, is structured by the greater will's agenda. Even your motivation to become Elden Lord is, at least in part, a response to the pull of grace, to the divine light guiding you toward a purpose someone else decided for you. This is why the alternate endings, Ranni's Age of Stars, the Frenzied Flame ending, the Age of the Duskborn, feel so significant. They are not just different political outcomes. They are the player character choosing, after a very long journey, to do something other than what the greater will set them up to do. To refuse the role, to put something else in place. Godwyn the Golden and the First Death. We talked about Godwyn earlier in the context of the Rune of Death and the Knight of the Black Knives. But Godwyn deserves more attention than that because what happened to him might be the single most cosmically consequential event in the game's backstory. Godwyn was Marika's firstborn son with Godfrey. He was beloved. The lore describes him as genuinely kind, as someone who made peace with enemies rather than simply defeating them, who treated the Sea of Stars as something to wonder at rather than conquer. He is described in purely positive terms, which is unusual in the Elden Ring lore where most powerful figures have complicated or dark aspects. When the Black Knife assassins killed him using the stolen Rune of Death, something went wrong. The Rune of Death was used in a divided way, split between Godwyn's killing and Ranni's self-performed death. Because it was split, the killing was incomplete. Godwyn's soul was slain, but his body continued to live in a corrupted form. The lore calls this the First Death, and also calls Godwyn the Prince of Death as a result. His body, buried beneath Leyndell, kept growing. It became the source of the death root that spreads through the world. Its influence turned the area beneath the capital into a place of death and corruption. Fia's questline is built around his corpse, and the deep-root depths are dominated by the physical spread of his corrupted remains. The theological horror of this from the Golden Order's perspective is considerable. The Rune of Death was locked away specifically to prevent true death from existing in the world. The Golden Order's promise was that souls would return to the Erdtree and be recycled into new life. Godwyn's death broke that promise in a specific and terrible way. His soul was truly gone, truly dead in the permanent sense, while his body persisted and spread corruption. What outer god, if any, benefited from this? The god of death, if there is one, might have gained something from the permanent death of Godwyn's soul. The god of rot gained a foothold through the death root, spreading across the underground world. The greater will lost something, lost the integrity of its system, lost the promise it had made to every mortal in the lands between that death was not final. Some readings suggest that Godwyn's death was specifically designed to destabilize the Golden Order in ways that went beyond simple assassination. That whoever helped Ranni plan the Night of the Black Knives understood that killing Godwyn this way, in this particular incomplete manner, would create a wound in the world that the greater will could not easily heal. If that is correct, then Godwyn's death was not just a murder. It was a cosmic attack on the infrastructure of the Golden Order itself. The Two Fingers and what they lost. The Two Fingers appear in Elden Ring as wizened, dried-out appendages housed in Round Table Hold and other locations, communicating with finger readers who translate their gestures into guidance for the Tarnished. They are clearly meant to be revered, and clearly meant to be the authoritative voice of the greater will in the lands between. But by the time you meet them, they are deeply compromised. The communication has broken down. The guidance they offer is often vague or circular. Ania, the finger reader in Round Table Hold, acknowledges that she cannot hear them clearly anymore. The system is intact in form, but uncertain in function. What happened to the Two Fingers? The lore suggests that Marika's shattering of the Elden Ring damaged the communication between the greater will and its representatives in the world. The fingers were conduits for a divine signal, and the signal was disrupted. They did not die, they persisted, but they became like a radio tower still standing after the broadcast station was destroyed, still able to receive faint signals, still pointing in the direction of what they were built to receive, but no longer clear. This matters because it means that for the duration of the game, the greater will is operating in the lands, between through damaged channels. The guidance you receive through grace, through the fingers, through the maiden figures who interpret the fingers, is an interpretation of a signal that is already compromised. The Golden Order's chain of command has a broken link in it, and the Elden Ring's shattering put it there. Melina, your maiden, is notably not affiliated with any Two Fingers. She appears without explanation, offers herself as a guide, and admits at various points that her origins are unclear even to herself. She seems to have her own connection to something, possibly to Marika, possibly to the Erd Tree, in a direct and unmediated way. Whether she is an agent of the greater will or something more independent, the lore leaves open in a way that feels deliberate rather than unresolved. The Outer Gods and the Empyreans. We have mentioned Empyreans several times, but it is worth being precise about what they are and why the Outer Gods care about them so much. An Empyrean is a mortal born with the potential to ascend to godhood. They are born from a single god rather than two, which the lore suggests gives them a purity of divine essence that makes them capable of becoming vessels. Marika, Rani, Michaela, Malenia, and the Glowmide Queen are all described as Empyreans. The Two Fingers select Empyreans as candidates to replace Marika, but the lore implies that other outer gods can also make claims on Empyreans. Malenia was claimed by the god of Rot, not through her choice, but through her birth. The Formless Mother claimed Moog, who was not an Empyrean, but who wanted to elevate Michaela, an Empyrean, to divine status under her banner. Rani appears to have been claimed, or at least courted, by whatever lunar divine presence exists in the stars. The outer gods need Empyreans, because direct divine presence in the physical world is apparently not something they can sustain indefinitely. The Elden Beast can be there, in the world, as the greater will's vessel, but it is described as a sent thing, an emissary, not the greater will itself. For an outer god to truly establish itself in a world, it seems to need a mortalish being who can interface with that world on its behalf. This gives the Empyreans tremendous cosmic leverage and also makes them targets. Every Empyrean in the game's lore has been manipulated, imprisoned, mutilated, weaponized, or killed by forces trying to control their potential. Malenia has been imprisoned by Rot her whole life. Michaela was kidnapped and subjected to a blood ritual. Rani killed herself preemptively to escape this fate. The Glowmide Queen was defeated and imprisoned by Malekith. Even Marika herself, the most successful of them all, was eventually crucified in the Erd Tree by the Greater Will as punishment for her defiance. The fate of Empyreans in this world is not glory. It is to be used until they break or rebel, and then to be replaced. The outer gods are patient. They have other candidates. The individual being inside the vessel is incidental to the cosmic agenda. The tarnished as a theological category. Here is something the game implies but never quite states directly. The tarnished as a group represents something theologically significant within the greater will's framework. They are people who had grace and lost it, who are exiled and then recalled, but they are also people who, unlike fully graced individuals, have some degree of resistance to the outer god's direct manipulation. Melina notes that the tarnished are different from ordinary people. The ability to be revived by sights of grace, the ability to hold remembrances of defeated demigods, the ability to accumulate and use runes from defeated enemies. These are not simply game mechanics. They are described in lore terms as properties specific to the tarnished. One reading of this is that the tarnished are a kind of theological wildcard. They are connected to grace, to the greater will system, but they are not fully embedded in it. They have been outside it, beyond the fog, in a place where the Erd Tree's light does not reach, and that has given them something, a degree of autonomy, a capacity for choice that fully graced individuals do not have. This is why only a tarnished can meaningfully approach the different endings. A fully graced being would simply follow the Golden Order's path, because that is all the Golden Order's light leads toward. The player character's journey is, under this reading, the journey of someone who was discarded, who survived outside the system, who came back with enough independence to either restore the system or replace it with something else. The outer gods, all of them, have some interest in what the tarnished does. The greater will wants the Elden Ring restored and the order maintained. The Formless Mother presumably wants a tarnished who will spread her influence. The Frenzied Flame wants a tarnished willing to become the Lord of Chaos. Even Ranni needs a tarnished as her consort to help establish the Age of Stars. Everyone in the divine hierarchy of Elden Ring wants something from the tarnished, and the act of choosing which path to follow is the act of deciding which god, if any, you are willing to serve. The Eternal Cities and their ambition. The Nox people of the Eternal Cities are one of the more fully realized ancient civilizations in the lore, and their story is one of the clearest examples of what happens when mortals try to compete with outer gods rather than serve them. The Nox built underground cities vast and elaborate, lit by their own silver tears and their own astronomical magic. The lore describes them as having attempted to build a path to the outer skies, to reach the stars not as worship but as ambition. They wanted to become players at the cosmic level, rather than pieces on the board. Astal fell on them. The meteorite creature from the void annihilated their civilization, took their sky from them, left them underground and broken. Whether this was a directed punishment from some outer god or simply the random violence of space falling on ambition, the lore leaves genuinely ambiguous. But the pattern is one that repeats throughout Elden Ring's history. When mortals reach upward too far, something reaches back. The silver tears, the liquid mercury-like creatures that live in the Eternal Cities and that can mimic the forms of other beings, are described as an attempt by the Nox to create life. They wanted their own creations. They wanted the godlike ability to make things that live and move. Whether this is related to their astronomical ambition or separate from it, the result is a civilization of mimics, of copies, of forms without fixed identity. There is something deeply sad about the Eternal Cities as they exist in the game. They are underground. They have no sky. Their people are diminished remnants of a more ambitious civilization. Their greatest creation is a race of mimics who copy other things because they do not have stable forms of their own. It reads like a theological punishment for the sin of ambition, except the Elden Ring lore is careful never to call it that explicitly. It could just be what happens when something powerful falls on something fragile from a great height. What the Nox story adds to the Outer Gods framework is a sense of scale and danger. These are not gods that mortals can negotiate with, or petition, or impress with their cleverness. The distance between mortal ambition and outer god capacity is the distance between a city and the sky that fell on it. The wandering nobles and the rot's ecology. One of the quieter evidences of the god of rot's presence is how the rot spreads through living communities. The wandering nobles in Caelid, the soldiers and knights in the Scarlet Rot areas, are not simply diseased. The lore and their behaviour suggests they have been incorporated into something. They do not flee the rot, they move within it, through it, as though it is their environment rather than their killer. The rot does not simply destroy, it transforms. The plants, the creatures, the people caught in the lake of rot, or in the depths of Caelid, are not dead in the conventional sense. They are in the process of becoming something that belongs to a different order. The rot has its own ecology, its own beauty, in a horrible way, its own logic of which things it takes and which it leaves. Melania's blooming is the most extreme version of this. When she releases the rot fully, she becomes something that the game describes as a flower of death, a scarlet blossom that radiates rot outward as a kind of divine expression. The imagery is deliberately floral, deliberately beautiful, because the god of rot's framework is not one of ugliness and disease in its own terms. It is one of profligate, overwhelming, suffocating life, of so much growth that nothing else can exist alongside it. The Scarlet Rot is not the Golden Order's opposite in a simple way. The Golden Order manages life carefully, controls death, recycles souls. The rot throws all of that away in favour of raw proliferation. It is abundance as annihilation. It grows until there is nothing left to grow into. Whether the god of rot is conscious of this in any recognisable sense, the game does not say. Gods in Elden Ring are not portrayed as having human-like consciousness and motivations in ways that would make them relatable. They have drives, tendencies, something like will, but whether the god of rot decided to spread across the lands between, or whether the spread is simply what the rot does, the way a fire burns without deciding to, that distinction is never made clear. The Empyrean Needle and the god of rot's claim on Melania. There is a specific piece of lore that clarifies the relationship between Miquella and the god of rot in a way that reframes everything about Melania's story. Miquella crafted a needle, golden and divine, specifically designed to suppress the outer god that inhabited Melania. The fact that a needle could do this, that suppressing an outer god's presence in a person was even something a needle-sized object could attempt, is itself significant. It suggests that an outer god's influence operates through a kind of channel, a point of contact, something that can be interrupted or sealed if you know what you're doing. Miquella knew enough about divine mechanics to construct a sealing object. He was the most gifted of the demigods, precisely in this kind of theurgical engineering, in the ability to work with divine forces at a technical level rather than simply channeling them. The needle did not cure Melania, but it could suppress the rot temporarily in someone who carried it, which is relevant because Commander O'Neill, the boss found in the swamp of Aeonia, drops an unalloyed gold needle that you can eventually bring to Melania. The questline that follows is one of the most emotionally layered in the game because it does not resolve cleanly. Melania cannot be saved. The needle helps, briefly, but the god of rot's claim on her is too deep, too fundamental to who she is. This points towards something important about how the outer god's possession of mortals works in this lore. It is not simply an external force acting on a person. It is woven into that person at such a fundamental level that removing it would require removing them. The god of rot is inside Melania in a way that is inseparable from her life. The rot is her. She is the rot. They are not two things sharing a body. They are one thing that she has been fighting her entire life without ever being able to fully locate the line where she ends and it begins. The divine towers and the outer god's infrastructure, The divine towers scattered across the map of the lands between are another piece of the greater will's physical infrastructure that is easy to overlook as a landmark rather than a theologically meaningful structure. Each divine tower is connected to a shard of the Elden Ring held by a specific demigod. When you bring the remembrance of a great rune holder to the corresponding tower, you can restore the rune to its full power. The towers are, in other words, nodes in the Elden Ring's network, physical structures built to interface between the divine law, encoded in the ring, and the mortal world that law governs. The fact that these towers exist, that they had to be built, that they are this specific and architectural in their function, suggests something about how the greater will's order actually works. It is not simply magic in the air, it is infrastructure. It requires physical objects and physical locations to function. The Erd Tree is the most visible piece of this, but the divine towers, the two fingers in their sanctuaries, the sites of grace distributed across the land, all of these are part of a system that someone designed and built and has to be maintained. When the system breaks, when the Elden Ring shatters, this infrastructure does not disappear. It becomes decoupled from its purpose. The towers still stand, the sites of grace still glow, the two fingers still gesture, but the central organizing logic that all of this pointed toward is gone, and so the infrastructure is like a clock without hands, still ticking but not telling time. Other outer gods, presumably, do not have this kind of infrastructure, or have different kinds. The Formless Mother communicates through blood and dreams. The Frenzied Flame communicates through the three fingers and through frenzy madness. The god of rot communicates through the rot itself, through the spread of the disease, as a kind of signal. None of them have towers or fingers or grace sites. They operate more organically, through bodies and substances and altered states of consciousness. This difference in operational style says something about the nature of each god. The greater will is orderly, systematic, architectural. The other outer gods are wilder, more intimate, more personal in how they reach their followers. Whether that makes the greater will more powerful or simply more organized is a question the game does not answer. Malekith and the Black Blade. Malekith, the Black Blade, is Marika's shadow, her sworn protector, a beast that she tamed or created, or both, and to whom she entrusted the Rune of Death once she had extracted it from the Elden Ring. He carries it in his blade, and he has guarded it across the entire span of the Golden Order's history. Malekith's relationship to the Outer God framework is interesting because he represents the Golden Order's attempt to manage one of the most dangerous forces in existence. Destined death, the permanent, irreversible death that the gloam-eyed queen wielded, is itself arguably a manifestation of a divine force, possibly the god of death we discussed earlier. By sealing it in Malekith's blade, Marika effectively took that force and made it a personal weapon rather than a cosmic law. The godskin apostles that Malekith defeated were the warriors of the gloam-eyed queen, and the way they fought, using the flayed skins of gods as weapons, suggests that the power they served was genuinely capable of killing divine beings. Destined death could slay gods. The gloam-eyed queen wielded it. Malekith took it from her, sealed it, and became its keeper. What happens in the final portion of the game when you kill Malekith? The seal breaks, destined death is released back into the world. Everything the Golden Order was protected by, the promise that the Elden Ring's custodians could not be permanently killed, the promise that the Erd Tree could not be truly destroyed, all of that becomes vulnerable again. Killing Malekith is arguably the most theologically radical thing the player character does in the entire game, because it undoes Marika's single, most significant act of divine manipulation. Whether this is a liberation or a catastrophe depends on which ending you choose, and the outer gods are all presumably affected by it in different ways. The god of death, if there is one, gets its force back. The greater will loses its protection. The frenzied flame finds the world more vulnerable. The god of rot continues spreading regardless, because the rot was never stopped by Malekith's seal to begin with. What the stars remember. There is a line of thinking in the Elden Ring lore that the stars are not just points of light or sources of power, but records, witnesses, things that have been present for longer than the lands between has existed, and that carry some memory of what was there before and what passed through. The astrologer class description says that the astrologers abandoned their stargazing when the glintstone sorceries became more practical, which implies that studying stars was once a primary method of divination in the world. The Nox people practiced astronomical magic. Ranni's agenda centers on the stars leading the world forward. Even the Greater Will's origin is described as the outer skies, the same direction you look when you look at stars. What do the stars remember? The game does not say directly, but the accumulation of star-related detail points towards something like this. Before the Greater Will arrived, before the Elden Ring was planted in the lands between, the stars were the primary divine reference point for the world. People looked up to understand what forces governed them, and what they saw in the stars was something older than the Erdtree's golden light. The outer skies are where outer gods come from. They fall from there, or are sent from there, or travel through there. The stars might be markers of where they are, or where they have been, or what they want. Ranni's hope for an age of stars, where the stars guide without dominating, might be a hope for a return to that older relationship between the world and the divine, before the Golden Order imposed itself and made the stars merely background. Whether that is a romantic notion or a viable alternative is something the game refuses to adjudicate. The stars do not speak in the game, not directly. They shine. They point. They lead Ranni and the player character toward an ending that none of the other gods seem to plan for. The Greater Will's silence. One of the most striking things about the Greater Will as an outer god is how absent it seems during the events of the game. The Elden Ring is shattered. The lands between is in chaos. The Golden Order is in ruins. Demigods are fighting each other. Tarnished are being recalled. And the Greater Will, the supreme cosmic authority behind all of this, does nothing visible. It does not intervene. It does not speak. It does not send reinforcements from the outer skies. It operates through the existing infrastructure, through the two fingers, through the grace that guides the tarnished, through the elden beast waiting at the top of Lanedell. But it does not fix anything. It waits for someone else to fix it. Several readings of the lore suggest that this is not indifference, but inability, that the Greater Will's ability to directly intervene in the lands between is constrained by something, by the shattering, by the rules of how outer gods can interact with mortal worlds, or by something else entirely that the game does not explain. The two fingers withered and went quiet. The communication broke. The Greater Will may simply not be able to reach the lands between clearly anymore. Another reading is that the Greater Will is patient on a timescale that makes the entire shattering look like a brief setback, thousands of years of the Golden Order. A few centuries of chaos while tarnished are recalled and sorted to find one capable of becoming Elden Lord. That is nothing to an entity from the outer skies. The Greater Will can wait. A third reading is darker, that the Greater Will does not care about the individual suffering in the lands between in any way that we would recognize as caring, that the mortals under the Erdtree are simply components of a system, and the system will be repaired or replaced according to the Greater Will's needs, and the component suffering in the meantime is not a factor in its calculations. Any of these readings is consistent with the lore. The game deliberately leaves the Greater Will's interiority inaccessible, because a god whose inner life you could fully understand would be a smaller and less frightening thing than what the lore seems to be pointing at. The space between gods. What you start to feel after sitting with all of this lore for a long time is that the lands between is not special to the outer gods in the way it is special to the people who live there. To the fire giants, the Nox, the mortals under the Erd Tree, the lands between, is the world, the only one, the place where everything that matters happens. To the outer gods, it seems more like a territory, a region of influence, a place where a particular set of forces is currently dominant. The Greater Will sent the Elden Ring here, but it presumably has influence elsewhere too. The Formless Mother's relationship with blood presumably extends to any world where blood exists. The Frenzied Flame's impulse toward dissolution is presumably not geographically limited. The outer skies from which Astal fell presumably contain other things besides Astal. This is what makes the outer gods so cosmically vertiginous to think about. They are not gods of the lands between. They are gods that happen to be interested in or active in the lands between right now. The scale implied by that is almost impossible to hold in your head, which is probably why the game does not try to make you hold it. It just lets you feel it at the edges, in the descriptions, in the way characters talk about the outer skies, with a combination of reverence and terror. Millennia carries a god inside her. Morg loved a god who gave him its blood across an impossible distance. The frenzied flame waits beneath the lands. Between's foundation, something so old and so vast that its desire to unmake everything reads more like gravity than malice. The people caught between all of this, the tarnished, the demigods, the scholars and soldiers, and wandering merchants, are living in the space where enormous forces happen to be competing. They build their theologies and their rituals and their allegiances, not because the gods care about being understood, but because the alternative to meaning-making is looking directly at the scale of what is happening and being unable to function. The Elden Ring itself, the golden wheel of law that the Elden Beast carried from the outer skies, is the most honest symbol in the game. It is a ring. It is closed. It is the Greater Will's order imposed on a world that was not asked whether it wanted it. And now it is shattered, and the pieces are scattered across the map in the hands of people who have no idea what to do with them. And the outer skies are still there, still full of things, still indifferent to the names that the people below them have made up to describe them. The outer gods do not know that you're out there looking for their story. They do not know this video exists. They do not know that anyone is sitting in the dark right now, listening to all of this, trying to make sense of the enormous, ancient, indifferent architecture of power that the world they built their game inside of implied. But you are. And now, at least, you have the shape of it. You said, "Continue, 2304. Claude responded, "The Frenzied Flame." Beneath the earth, the Frenzied Flame, beneath the earth. We talked about the Frenzied Flame earlier as an ideological counterpoint to the Golden Order, but there is a physical dimension to it that deserves more attention. The Frenzied Flame is not simply a cosmic force that exists somewhere out in the void. It has a location. It is underneath everything. The Frenzied Flame prescription is a door beneath Lane Dell, beneath the sewers, beneath the dungeons, beneath the sewers. It is as far down as you can go in the capital city of the Golden Order's civilization. And what is at the bottom is the thing the Golden Order fears most. The three fingers wait there in the dark. The flame itself is there, pressing against the underside of the world. This geography is not accidental. The game is telling you something about the relationship between the Golden Order and the Frenzied Flame by putting them in this spatial arrangement. The most perfect expression of the Greater Will's order. Lindell, the golden capital, the city built around the Erd Tree, is sitting directly on top of its own antithesis. The Frenzied Flame did not arrive from outside and position itself here. It was here first, or at least it has been here long enough that the city grew over it without eliminating it. One reading of this is that the Frenzied Flame is older than the Golden Order, that it was present in the lands between before the Elden Beast arrived, before the Elden Ring was planted, before Marika became God. that the chaos which the Frenzied Flame represents is the baseline state of the world, and the Golden Order is the imposition laid over it. And underneath every golden surface, the chaos is still there, waiting. This would make the Frenzied Flame not an invader or an alternative, but a remnant, the thing that was there before the Order came, and that cannot be fully suppressed, no matter how deep you bury it, or how many floors of sewage and dungeon you put between the Golden City and the fire below. The three fingers themselves are interesting in this context. They are clearly analogous to the two fingers of the greater will, which suggests a deliberate structural parallel. Two systems, two sets of representatives, one above and one below. The two fingers gesture toward order and ask you to become Elden Lord. The three fingers embrace you with burns and ask you to become the Lord of Chaos. The symmetry feels designed, feels like the game is suggesting that these two forces are in some sense equals, or at least that they have been in competition for long enough that they have developed mirror image structures. Whether the three fingers are as old as the two fingers, or whether the Frenzied Flame created its own representatives in imitation of the greater wills, is not something the lore resolves. But the physical fact of the Frenzied Flame beneath Lindel makes the Golden Order feel less like a stable foundation and more like a lid on something that has never stopped pressing upward. The Age of Stars and what it means for the gods. Ranni's ending is the one that the game seems to frame most sympathetically, or at least the most care has been put into making it feel like a genuine alternative, rather than simply a different flavour of the same divine domination. But it is worth asking what the Age of Stars actually means for the outer gods and their relationship to the lands between. If Ranni's plan succeeds, the Elden Ring is not restored. The Golden Order is not reinstated. A different kind of order, one based on the moon and stars, begins to guide the world forward. The Tarnished, the player character, becomes Ranni's consort and travels with her as the moon leads the world from a distance. What happens to the other outer gods in this scenario? The game does not say explicitly, but the logic of Ranni's plan suggests that she is trying to establish a kind of divine order that is not controlled by any of the known outer gods. Not the greater will, not the Formless Mother, not the god of rot. Something genuinely new, or at least genuinely unaffiliated. The question of whether this is possible, whether an Empyrean can genuinely create a new divine order without becoming a vessel for an existing outer god, is one of the most interesting theological questions the game raises. Ranni seems to believe it is possible. She has been operating without a body, without a patron god, for what seems like a very long time, sustained by her own will and whatever connection to lunar power she has cultivated. But the lore around Empyrean suggests that they are by nature targets, things that want to use them. The greater will wants to replace Marika with one of them. Other outer gods want their own vessels. If Ranni truly establishes an Age of Stars, the question of what the greater will does in response, whether it simply accepts that this particular world has slipped out of its grasp, whether it tries to intervene from the outer skies, whether the two fingers simply wither entirely, all of that is left open. The ending shows you Ranni and the Tarnished departing into the stars together. The world shrinks below you. The Erdtree is still there, but its meaning has changed. It is no longer the centre of everything. It is just a tree. What comes after that? What the outer gods do when one of their potential vessels escapes with a piece of the world's future, that is a story the game deliberately does not tell. The curse mark of death and the split soul. The curse mark of death is one of the most specific and strange items in the game's lore. It was carved into Ranni's flesh, the mark of the rune of death that was split on the night of the Black Knives. When the rune of death was used on both Ranni and Godwyn simultaneously, but incompletely, the result was Godwyn's body living without a soul, and Ranni's soul living without a body. The curse mark is the physical record of that split. It is a brand, a wound that carries within it the memory of a death that did not complete itself. Fia wants it. She uses it in the creation of the mending rune of the Death Prince, her version of a restored Elden Ring that would incorporate destined death back into the world's order rather than suppressing it. What does this have to do with the outer gods? The curse mark represents a moment when multiple divine forces intersected in a single event and produced something that none of them fully controlled. The rune of death belongs to the god of death's domain. The greater will owns the structure of the Elden Ring that the rune was taken from. Ranni's plan involved her own divine agency and whatever patron she has in the lunar forces. Godwyn's death created the death root that feeds the god of Rot's presence underground. One event, the Night of the Black Knives, touched almost every outer god's domain simultaneously, and the curse mark is the scar tissue of that event, the physical object that carries all of those intersecting divine forces in one place. The fact that Fia can use it to mend the Elden Ring in a particular way suggests that the intersection of divine forces in a single object gives it a kind of theological leverage, the ability to speak to multiple systems at once. This is one of the most elegant pieces of world building in the game, even if you only notice it when you sit with the lore long enough. The outer gods are not simply separate forces in separate domains. They interact. Their domains overlap. Events in one god's territory create ripples in another's. And the mortals caught in those intersections become strange objects. Malenia carrying Rot and humanity together. Ranni carrying a soul without a body. Godwyn carrying a body without a soul. All of them artifacts of divine forces that could not help but touch each other. The Godskin Apostles and what they remember. The Godskin Apostles are enemies you encounter throughout the game, and their lore is some of the most disturbing in Elden Ring. They are the surviving warriors of the Gloam-eyed Queen, priests of a goddess who was defeated and whose power was sealed away by Malekith. They should be relics, historical curiosities, people whose god is gone and whose purpose is moot. But they are not defeated. They are still out there, still practicing, still wearing the flayed skins of gods as armour and as weapon. The Godskin Peeler and the Godskin Stitcher, their primary weapons, describe their craft in terms that make clear this is not simply violence. It is a religious practice, a form of worship or offering to the deity they still serve. What does it mean to serve a god who has been defeated? In most fantasy settings, a defeated god is simply gone, and its followers either die or convert. In Elden Ring, the Godskin Apostle suggests something different. The Gloam-eyed Queen was defeated but not destroyed. Destined death was sealed but not eliminated. The gods' warriors carry on because the divine force they represent is still present in the world, suppressed but not gone, sealed in Amalekith's blade but not annihilated. This gives the Godskin Apostles a strange dignity in the lore, even as they are horrifying enemies. They are keeping a faith alive, not because their god is powerful and rewarding them for it, but because the thing they believe in is real and has not ceased to exist just because the dominant power structure said it should. Their presence scattered throughout the world, in churches, in towers, in places you would not expect them, suggests that the Gloam-eyed Queen's faith has underground networks, hidden continuities, the kind of survival that suppressed religious movements develop when the dominant power cannot fully root them out. The Golden Order has been trying to erase destined death from the world for a very long time, and these apostles are evidence that it has not entirely succeeded. When you release destined death by killing Malekith, what happens to the apostles? The game does not show you, but the implication is that they are, at that moment, vindicated. The force they have been keeping faith with across centuries of suppression returns to the world. Their god, or at least their god's power, is free again. Whether the Gloam-eyed Queen herself can return, in some form, whether the god of death whose instrument she was can reassert itself. Now that Malekith's seal is broken, these are questions that point toward a world beyond the game's ending that is far more cosmically unsettled than any of the Restoration endings suggest. The Crucible Knight's fidelity. Similarly to the Godskin Apostles, the Crucible Knights represent a fidelity to something that the dominant order has tried to move beyond. They are warriors from the early age of the Erd Tree, soldiers who served Godfrey in the time before the Golden Order fully consolidated, and they carry in their bodies and their incantations traces of the Crucible, the primordial generative force that preceded the Erd Tree's clean taxonomy of life. The Crucible Knights have tails, they have wings. Their incantations summon aspects of ancient life. The tail swipe, the breath attack, the wing manifestation, all things that belong to a more fluid age of existence. The Golden Order would classify these as aberrant or primitive, as things that the Erd Tree's order has properly superseded. The Crucible Knights treat them as sacred. What does this tell us about the Crucible as a divine force? It suggests that the Crucible had or has something like a religious community, people who valued its generative chaos over the Golden Order's managed growth. Godfrey's warriors, the first Elden Lord soldiers, were Crucible-aspected. The very military foundation of the Golden Order was built on soldiers who embodied the thing the Golden Order was marginalizing. Whether this was intentional on Godfrey's part, whether he chose Crucible-aspected warriors out of genuine appreciation for what they represented, or simply because they were the best fighters available, the lore does not say. But the result is a set of ancient guardians who are simultaneously foundational to the Golden Order's history and theologically at odds with its mature doctrine. The Crucible incantations that the player can use all carry descriptions emphasizing their ancientness, their primordiality, their connection to something older than the Erd Tree's current form. Using them feels like reaching through the Golden Order into what the world was before it, and the fact that the game lets you do this, that Crucible magic is accessible and powerful, and not presented as forbidden in the way that, say, the Frenzied Flame is, suggests that the Golden Order's suppression of the Crucible was never complete. Perhaps it could not be. The Crucible is not an outer god from the stars. It is something native to the world itself, something that grew from the world's own generative principle before any external divine force arrived to impose order on it. You cannot fully eliminate something that is part of a world's fundamental biology, the Fingerslayer blade and the war on the two fingers. Deep in the eternal city of Nokron, you find the Fingerslayer blade, and it is one of the most startling objects in the game's lore. It is described as a weapon capable of killing the two fingers, the physical representatives of the greater will's authority in the lands between. It exists. It was made. Someone at some point wanted to kill the two fingers badly enough to construct a specific weapon for it. Who made it? The Nox people of the Eternal Cities, the underground civilization that was punished by Astel for reaching toward the stars. They made a blade specifically designed to kill the divine representatives of the dominant cosmic order. This is extraordinary. The Nox were already at odds with the greater will, already underground, already punished, and they responded to that punishment by making a god-killing weapon and hiding it in their city. The defiance implied by that is staggering. Not simple resistance or survival, but active counter-warfare against the divine order that had destroyed them. Why did they want to kill the two fingers? The lore around the Nox suggests that their imprisonment underground, the loss of their sky, the destruction of their ambition, was something they attributed to the greater will's order. The Fingerslayer blade might be an artifact of a civilization that decided, after everything was taken from them, that the appropriate response was to build the means to fight back. Ranni wants this blade. It is the object she sends you to retrieve from Nokron. She uses it to allow Blade, her half-wolf loyal companion, to be freed from the constraints placed on him by the two fingers, at least temporarily. and it is part of her broader project of operating outside and against the greater will's system. The fact that the Nox made it and Rani uses it connects two different kinds of defiance across a large span of history. The Nox defied the greater will through ambition, by trying to reach the stars. The defiance was answered with annihilation. Rani defies the greater will through cunning, by operating through proxies and plans that the two fingers cannot easily counter. She uses the Nox's weapon in a smarter way than the Nox were able to, because she has had the benefit of watching what happened to them. The shattering as a divine event. We have talked about the shattering, the breaking of the Elden Ring by Marika in various contexts throughout this video, but it is worth taking a moment to consider it specifically as a theological event, as something that changed the relationship between the outer gods and the lands, between in a fundamental way. Before the shattering, the Golden Order was intact. The Elden Ring governed life and death. The greater will's authority was absolute. The other outer gods had presence and influence. The Formless Mother had Mog, the god of rot had Malenia. The Frenzied Flame pressed against the underside of Leyndell, but none of them could challenge the Golden Order's structural dominance. After the shattering, the governing law of the world broke into pieces and scattered. The divine framework that had been maintaining the Golden Order's supremacy fragmented. And in that fragmentation, every other outer god found room to expand. The scarlet rot spread across Caelid in the aftermath of Radahn and Malenia's battle, which happened as a direct consequence of the shattering's chaos. The Frenzied Flame presumably grew closer to the surface as the Order pressing it down weakened. The Formless Mother's influence through Mog went uncontested as the Golden Order's enforcers fell apart in the War of the Demigods. The God of Rot found new territory as Deathroot spread through the underground. The shattering was not just a political crisis, it was a divine power vacuum, and every outer god, with any foothold in the lands between, rushed to fill it. The chaos of the War of the Demigods is what you see when you remove the structural law that was keeping multiple, competing divine forces in check. What you get is not simply human warfare, it is warfare between different orders of existence, each one backed by a cosmic force with its own agenda, playing out through the bodies of demigods who may or may not understand what they are really fighting for. Radahn, arguably, is the clearest example of someone fighting on behalf of an order. He was the greatest warrior of his generation, capable of holding back the stars through his gravity magic, and he chose to do so. The stars, in his reading of things, were dangerous. They needed to be stopped. Whether he understood that he was essentially fighting to keep certain cosmic forces at bay, that his gravity magic was in some sense a mortal man's attempt to hold back the outer skies, is left to interpretation. But the image of one person holding back the stars is one of the most striking in the entire game, and it carries more weight when you understand what the stars might represent. The Erd Tree's nature. The Erd Tree is so central to the visual identity of Elden Ring that it is easy to treat it as simply a setting element, a backdrop. But the Erd Tree is a body. It is the greater will's physical presence in the world, or at least the presence of the Elden Ring's law, made into organic matter. The golden light of the Erd Tree governs grace. It governs the recycling of souls. It governs the boundaries between life and death. It is the operating system of the world, and it is also alive in some sense, alive in the way that very large and very old things that do not move or speak are alive, with a kind of vegetative, divine consciousness that the game never gives words to. When the Erd Tree burns in certain endings, when you light the Forge of the Giants and use the fire of the Fell God to destroy it, the world does not simply lose a landmark. It loses the physical infrastructure of the dominant divine order. Whatever comes after that, whatever ending you pursue after burning the Erd Tree, happens in a world where the greater will's main physical presence has been destroyed. This is why the Elden Beast fight happens after the Erd tree burns in the path that leads to that ending. The Elden Beast is defending what remains of its function. With the Erd tree gone, the Elden Beast is the last piece of the Greater Will's presence in the world, and it knows it. The desperation of that fight, the way the Elden Beast retreats and tries to survive, makes more sense when you understand that it is not simply a final boss. It is the last defender of a divine order whose main physical body you just burned. The question of what the Erd tree was before the Greater Will claimed it, whether it was always the Greater Will's vessel, or whether it was something native to the world that the Greater Will appropriated, is one the lore does not answer clearly. The Crucible suggests that there were golden generative forces in the world before the Elden Beast arrived. Whether the Erd tree grew from the Elden Ring that the Elden Beast brought, or whether there was already a tree and the Elden Ring was planted in it, changes the story considerably. If the Erd tree is entirely the Greater Will's creation, then burning it is simply destroying an outer god's infrastructure. If the Erd tree is something native to the world that the Greater Will colonized, then burning it is more complicated, both a rejection of the Greater Will's dominion and a destruction of something that was there before the dominion began. Marika's final prayer. There is a line that Marika speaks, or is implied to speak, within the lore that carries an enormous amount of weight. The remembrance of Marika, the item you receive for defeating her, describes her as having been both the master of the Elden Ring and its prisoner. She remade the world in the Greater Will's image, and she was trapped in it. She shattered the ring, and she was crucified for it. Whether Marika's shattering of the Elden Ring was an act of grief, an act of rebellion, or an act of madness, the game suggests that at some point she stopped believing that the Greater Will's order was good. A god who stops believing in their own order is one of the most interesting concepts in the lore, and the game never resolves it cleanly. What would Marika have wanted if she could have wanted freely? The lore offers hints. She locked away the Rune of Death, which might have been an act of mercy rather than control, an attempt to free mortals from permanent death. She chose Radagon, who was revealed to be another aspect of herself, as her second husband, which suggests something about the isolation of her divine position and her attempt to find connection even within the constraints of her role. She made children, many of them, and whatever the political implications of that, there is something in the sheer proliferation of demigods that suggests she wanted a full and complex family, rather than simply an arsenal of divine weapons. The outer gods made Marika what she was. The Greater Will chose her, or she chose it, and the result was a woman who became a god, and who, at some point, broke under the weight of that. Her story is the most human story in a game full of inhuman scale, and it is made human precisely because of the outer gods. Because it is a story about what happens to a person when they become the vessel for something vast and indifferent, and cannot find a way to remain themselves inside it. The other outer gods shaped people too. Moog was shaped by the Formless Mother's attention into something grandiose and devoted. Melania was shaped by the god of rot into something tragic and indomitable. The gloam-eyed queen was shaped by whatever god of death she served into a warrior capable of killing gods. All of these people, all of these demigods and warriors and worshippers became what they became because an outer god's influence touched them. That is the deepest thing the outer god lore says about the world of Elden Ring. Not that gods are powerful, which is obvious, but that their power is intimate, that it changes people from the inside, that you cannot carry an outer god's influence through your life and come out the other side unchanged, that the war between cosmic forces is also, always, a war fought inside individual people who never asked to be battlegrounds. The Tarnished walks through that world and touches all of it. Every grace site is a reminder that the Greater Will chose you. Every blood flame spell is the Formless Mother's touch available to anyone who reaches for it. Every scarlet rot pool is the god of rot's ongoing claim on the land. Every whisper of frenzy madness is the frenzied flame pressing up through the floor. You cannot move through the lands between without walking through divine territory. Every step is on ground that some enormous, ancient, alien force has claimed. The map of the game is a map of competing divine jurisdictions, and the player character, the Tarnished, is the one being who has enough independence, enough outsider status to choose between them, rather than simply being born into one. The choice of ending is not a game mechanic. It is a theological statement. It is the Tarnished deciding which order they believe in, or deciding that none of them are worth serving, or deciding that the world would be better off without divine order at all. Every outer god we have talked about tonight is a vote in that election, a candidate offering something. None of them are honest about the cost. The world continues. The stars remain. Somewhere in the outer skies, vast things move according to purposes that have no names in any language spoken in the lands between. The Elden Ring was broken and remade or left broken depending on which ending you chose. The Erd tree stands or burns. Ranni travels into the unknown with the moon at her back. And underneath Lanedale, if you dug far enough, if you went down through the sewers and the dungeons and the frenzied flame prescription and kept going, you would find the fire that was there before the Golden City was built over it. It is still burning. You said, "Continue, continue, 2313. Claude responded, "The wandering stars and Astel's purpose, the wandering stars and Astel's purpose." We touched on Astel earlier as a meteorite creature from the void, but Astel deserves a much longer look, because the more you examine what it is and what it did, the stranger and more significant it becomes. There are actually two Astels in the game. Astel, natural born of the void, which you fight in the Lake of Rot to reach Ranni's ending, and Astel, stars of darkness, which you fight in the Yellow Annex tunnel in the consecrated snowfield. Two of them, the same creature or the same kind of creature, in two different places. This matters because it changes what Astel is. If there were only one, you could read it as a unique event, a singular catastrophe that fell on the eternal cities and left one enormous creature behind. But two of them suggests that Astel is a type of thing, rather than a specific thing, a category of being that exists in the outer skies and that can be sent, or that travels, or that falls more than once. The item description for the remembrance of the natural born says that Astel was born from the void of the cosmos, and that it descends on civilizations to erase them, to take their sky, to leave them roofless and diminished beneath the earth. The verb descends is interesting because it implies intentionality, or at least directionality. Astel does not simply fall, it descends. Something about that phrasing points toward purpose rather than accident. If Astel is a weapon rather than a creature, if it is something the outer skies send against civilizations that have displeased some divine authority, then the existence of two of them suggests an arsenal, a method, a repeatable process for punishing or eliminating threats. The Nox were punished by one Astel for reaching toward the stars. Is there another civilization somewhere in the game's history that was similarly punished by the second one? The lore does not say directly, but the consecrated snowfield. Astel, being in a different location, far from the eternal cities, points toward a different target, a different event, a different civilization that no longer exists. What does Astel actually do when it descends on a place? Beyond the physical destruction, the most distinctive thing is that it removes the sky. The eternal cities underground have no sky, because Astel took it from them. The lore does not explain the mechanism of this, and the game does not show you how you take a sky from a place. But the result is a civilization permanently cut off from the stars, permanently enclosed, permanently unable to look upward and see anything but stone. For people who had built their civilization around astronomical magic, around looking at the stars for guidance and power, losing the sky is not just a physical loss, it is a theological amputation. The Nox cannot practice the stargazing that defined them. They cannot reach for the outer skies they were punished for reaching toward. They are sealed underground with no connection to the divine forces they had been cultivating. Whatever god, if any, sent Astel as punishment, it chose the cruelest possible version of that punishment. Not death, but permanent severance, the gravity magic that Astel uses in its boss fight. The ability to manipulate stars and cosmic forces reinforces the sense that this creature is genuinely from the outer skies rather than simply from space in a physical sense. It uses the same kind of cosmic force that Radahn studied and mastered, which is itself interesting. Radahn learned gravity magic from the Alabaster Lord, a being described as having come down from the stars. There is a network of star-descended or star-connected beings in this world, and Astel is the most violent expression of it. The Alabaster Lords and the Stars' inhabitants. The Alabaster Lords are easy to miss because they appear as optional enemies in specific locations, but their lore adds another layer to the outer sky's cosmology. They are described as having ridden meteorites down to the lands between from the stars, and they are associated with gravity magic. Radahn learned his gravity sorceries from them, or from their tradition. This means that the stars are not simply a source of divine power or a home for outer gods. They are inhabited. There are beings in the outer skies who are distinct from the outer gods we have discussed. Beings who travel on meteorites, who practice a form of magic based on gravitational force, who occasionally come down to the lands between and interact with its inhabitants. Are the Alabaster Lords servants of an outer god? Are they independent intelligences from the cosmos? Are they a race of star-dwelling beings that have their own civilization somewhere beyond the world? The lore does not say. But their existence alongside Astel, alongside the Elden Beast's arrival from the outer skies, alongside Ranni's lunar magic and the Greater Will's stellar origin, builds a picture of the cosmos in Elden Ring as genuinely populated. Not empty space with occasional divine exceptions, but a complex environment full of different kinds of being, some of them godlike, and some of them merely ancient and strange. Radahn holding back the stars with his gravity magic was, in this context, holding back potential visitors, or invaders, or divine envoys. He was using a form of magic he learned from star dwellers to keep other star dwellers from arriving. The circularity of that is one of the more elegant details in the game. He mastered the outer sky's own language and used it to tell the outer skies to stay away. When Radahn is defeated and his hold on the stars breaks, the stars begin moving again. And shortly after, Ranni's questline advances because the stars moving is what allows her plan to proceed. The celestial event that Radahn was preventing is the celestial event that Ranni needed. His defeat was not simply a military victory in the War of the Demigods. It was a cosmic gate opening. The Formless Mother's other children. Mog is the most visible of the Formless Mothers chosen, but the lore suggests she has others, or has had others, or at least that her influence has spread to more than one person across the history of the lands between. The blood boon, the miracle that calls down drops of the Formless Mother's blood from above, is available to any faith-scaling character with the right stat investment. This is a subtle but significant thing. A miracle that literally calls down a god's blood from the sky is not something you would expect to be freely available. It suggests that the Formless Mother's generosity with her blood is not exclusive to Mog. She gives it to anyone who asks correctly, anyone who reaches towards her through the right kind of devotion. The blood flame blade, the blood boon, the various blood incantations scattered through the game all suggest a tradition of Formless Mother worship that extends beyond the Mogwyn dynasty. There are people who have been calling on her blood for a long time, practicing rites that predate Mog's particular arrangements with her. She is a god with a congregation, not just a patron with a single chosen champion. What does the Formless Mother want from all of this devotion? Blood is the obvious answer, but blood as what? As an offering, as a material, as evidence of mortality, of the fragility and warmth of living things. One reading of the Formless Mother is that she is drawn to blood because it is the most intimate proof of a body's existence, the thing that makes life undeniable, and that her relationship with her worshippers is a kind of intimacy she cannot otherwise have. She is formless. She has no body. She exists somewhere beyond the lands between in a state that the word formless suggests has no fixed physical reality. Blood, the most physical of substances, the warmest and most alive of things, might be what she is drawn to precisely because it is everything she is not. Her relationship with Moog, as tender and disturbing as the law describes it, might be the relationship of something that cannot bleed reaching toward the people who can. This does not make her benign. Moog built a dynasty of blood, kidnapped an Empyrean, and performed rituals that the law describes in terms of violation and obsession. The Formless Mother's love, if it can be called that, produces destructive results in the people who receive it. But the law hints at an emotional texture to her that the other outer gods largely lack, a sense that she is not simply hungry or ambitious, but lonely in whatever form loneliness takes for a formless being from beyond the world. The Rot god's patience. One of the things that distinguishes the god of Rot from the other outer gods is the sheer timescale of its operation. The scarlet rot did not arrive in the lands between with the shattering. The lake of rot deep in the underground suggests the rot has been present in the world for a very long time, quietly spreading through underground waterways, establishing its ecology in places where the Golden Order's light did not reach well. The rot is patient in a way that no human or demigod could be patient. It does not need to win quickly. It does not need to seize control or establish a dynasty or fight a war. It simply spreads. Every generation it is a little more present. Every catastrophe gives it a new foothold. Millennia's blooming over the Aeonian swamp was a catastrophic acceleration of what was already a slow, inevitable process. The rot was coming to the surface eventually. She just made it happen faster. The god of rot's strategy, if it can be called that, is ecological rather than political. It does not need worshippers in the way the Formless Mother needs them, or the greater will organizes them. It does not need a chosen champion to implement its will. It operates through the rot itself, through the biology of spread and transformation. Every creature infected by the rot becomes an agent of further spread without needing to understand or consent to the role. This is arguably the most alien of the outer gods from a human perspective, because there is the least room for relationship with it. Moog had a relationship with the Formless Mother. The Frenzied Flame recruits people who genuinely believe in its message. Even the greater will operates through representatives and structures and chosen vessels. The god of rot simply is, and the rot simply spreads, and the beings caught in it are not servants or worshippers. They are medium. Millennia is the exception. She is the rot's most powerful expression in the world, but she is also the one being who has maintained something like selfhood inside it. She has not been consumed. She has not lost herself to the spread the way the wandering nobles of Caerlead have. She remains Millennia, Blade of Michaela, fighter, sister, person, even as the rot uses her body as its most potent expression in the world. How she has maintained that selfhood is one of the most interesting unanswered questions in the game. The lore around her suggests it is sheer will, that she has simply refused to be fully absorbed into the rot's logic. But if the god of rot is as vast and patient and indifferent as the lore implies, a single person's will should not be enough to resist it. Unless something else is holding the rot in check within her, some remnant of Michaela's needle, some aspect of her Empyrean nature, some divine protection that the lore has not fully explained. Millicent's questline is the other side of this. Millicent is Millennia's daughter, or one of several daughters grown from her rot blossoms, and she is someone who has received a version of Miquella's needle and is trying to live with the rot while not being consumed by it. Her story is a smaller, more intimate version of Melinia's struggle. She wants to run, to be free, to exist as herself rather than as the rot's instrument. Whether she succeeds depends on choices the player makes, but her existence and the existence of her sisters suggests that the god of rot is not simply a destructive force. It creates things, strange, painful, remarkable things that would not exist without it. The Empyrean as a theological problem. The concept of an Empyrean creates a theological problem for every outer god simultaneously, which is probably why the outer gods are also interested in them. An Empyrean is a being who could become a god, not through worship, not through accumulation of power in the ordinary sense, but through a specific quality of divine essence they were born with. They are, in other words, a naturally occurring challenge to any existing divine order. A being who could replace the current god, become a vessel for a different outer god, or establish an entirely new divine framework is a wild card in any system that relies on stable divine authority. The greater will's approach to this problem is to manage it, to identify Empyreans early, to cultivate them, to guide them through two fingers and finger maiden relationships toward becoming the next Marika, the next vessel of the same system. This is orderly and predictable, assuming the Empyrean cooperates. The other outer gods' approaches vary. The Formless Mother tried to use Moog to elevate Miquella into her service, a violent and non-consensual approach that the lore frames as a kind of abduction and forced devotion. The god of rot did not try to recruit Melinia so much as simply inhabit her from birth, a preemptive claim. The lunar divine presence, if there is one, seems to have allowed Rani a degree of genuine agency, which might be why her plan is the only one that actually advances on her own terms. What none of the outer gods seem to have accounted for is an Empyrean who simply refuses. Rani killed her own body before anyone could fully claim her. That should not have been possible. An Empyrean deciding that the cost of divine power is too high and preemptively removing herself from the board is not a move the system was designed for. The two fingers went silent. The greater will lost a candidate, and Rani spent centuries as a soul in a doll's body, slowly assembling a plan that the outer skies did not anticipate. The existence of Rani as a successful refusal, or at least a partial one, implies that the outer gods are not omniscient. They can be surprised. Their plans can be outmaneuvered by a sufficiently clever and determined mortal, even one who is operating on a much smaller scale and with much less power. The limitation this reveals is significant. If the greater will could see everything, Rani's plan would have been stopped before it started. The fact that it was not suggests that divine foreknowledge in this world is limited, that the outer gods are powerful and ancient but not all-seeing. This is quietly hopeful in a world that is otherwise relentlessly bleak. The gods are not inevitable. Their plans can fail. Their chosen vessels can break free. Their certainties can be disrupted by someone patient and clever enough to find the gaps in a system that was never designed to account for genuine refusal. The lands between, as a living record. By the time you've walked through everything the game has to offer, from the shores of Limgrave to the peaks of the mountain tops of the giants, from the underground eternal cities to the heights of the Haligtree, from the rot swamps of Caelid to the snow plains of the consecrated snowfield, you have walked through a living record of the outer gods' competing claims. Every biome tells a story about which divine force has been dominant there and for how long. Limgrave, with its golden light and its sites of grace and its proximity to the Erd Tree, is the Golden Order's most intact territory. Caelid, with its scarlet rot and its ruined armies and its howling wind, is what the god of rot does to land when given enough time and a catastrophic enough event to accelerate its spread. The mountaintops of the giants, cold and wind-blasted and built around a forge that once belonged to a suppressed god, is the site of the fell god's imprisonment and the fire giant's mourning. Mogwyn Palace, its entire underground geography, drenched in red blood and crimson water, is what the Formless Mother's sustained presence does to a physical place. The lands between is not a neutral geography over which divine events happen. It is a geography shaped by divine events, carved and coloured and populated by the ongoing competition between outer gods. The reason the different regions feel so tonally distinct, why moving from Limgrave to Caelid feels like entering a different world rather than simply a different area, is because they are, in a theological sense, different worlds. They are territories under different divine jurisdictions, shaped by different cosmic forces operating over long periods of time. The underground, in particular, is a map of suppressed divine histories. The eternal cities exist because the Nox were pushed there. The Lake of Rot exists because the god of Rot's presence, underground, predates the Golden Order's dominance above. The roots of the Erd tree penetrate the underground, and the death root of Godwyn's corpse grows alongside them, two divine forces intertwined and opposed at the literal foundation of the world. Mogwyn Palace is accessible through a tear in the world's fabric, a hidden place the Formless Mother helped carve out. Going underground in Elden Ring is going backward in time, theologically speaking. The deeper you go, the older the divine claims become, the less the Golden Order has managed to assert itself, the more you find the remnants of what was there before the Erd tree's light reached this far down. It is archaeology as theology. Every descent reveals another layer of divine history that the surface world has tried to forget. What the outer gods want from each other. We have spent most of this video considering what each outer god wants from the lands, between and from mortals. But there is a question that the lore raises without quite answering, which is what the outer gods want from each other. Are they in active communication? Are they aware of each other? Is there a divine politics happening at the cosmic level that the mortal scale events of the game only partially reflect? The lore hints at this without making it explicit. The Greater Will clearly knows about the god of Rot, because Marika fought the Rot's influence during the Golden Order's history. The Frenzied Flame's position, directly below Lindell, suggests that the Greater Will has been actively containing it for as long as the city has existed. The removal of the Rune of Death suggests that the Greater Will took a specific action to limit the god of Death's access to the world. All of these are active measures. The Greater Will did not simply establish the Golden Order and ignore the other outer gods. It took specific targeted steps to limit their influence. That requires awareness of their existence, understanding of their methods, and the capacity to counteract them. The Greater Will knows its rivals. Whether they know it in the same way, whether they are equally aware of each other, the lore does not say. One reading of the entire history of the lands between is as a very slow, very large war between the Greater Will and every other outer god, fought almost entirely through proxy means. The Greater Will uses Marika, Malekith, the Two Fingers, the Erd Tree. The other outer gods use whoever they can reach, Mohg, Malenia, the Gloam-eyed Queen, the Frenzied Flame Evangelists. The mortals in between are the soldiers of a war they mostly cannot perceive, fighting for causes they understand in human terms. Loyalty, ambition, love, survival, without knowing that those human motivations are being channeled by cosmic forces for cosmic purposes. This is not a comfortable reading. It suggests that almost nothing that happens in the lands between is fully free, that every major historical event has a divine hand behind it somewhere. But the lore is careful to leave room for genuine human and demigod agency within that framework. Ranni chose to refuse. Malenia chose to keep fighting. Marika chose to shatter the ring. These choices had real consequences that the divine forces did not fully predict or control. The outer gods shape the conditions of choice without being able to fully determine the choices themselves. That gap between shaping and determining is where every interesting character in the game lives. It is where the tarnished lives. It is the space in which something like freedom exists, even in a world governed by forces of incomprehensible scale and indifference. The question that remains. After everything, after all the lore and all the history and all the competing divine claims, there is one question that the Elden Ring lore never answers and seems deliberately constructed to make unanswerable. Do the outer gods know what they are doing to the people in the lands between? Not whether they care, because the lore makes fairly clear that care in the human sense is not something these entities practice, but whether they perceive, in any meaningful way, the individual lives being shaped and broken and ended by their competition. Whether Malenia's suffering registers to the god of rot as anything other than a useful vessel performing its function. Whether Morg's love for the Formless Mother is something she experiences as love received or simply as blood offered. Whether the greater will, in whatever passes for its consciousness, has any awareness of the billions of souls cycling through the Erdtree system over thousands of years, as anything other than an ordered process functioning correctly. The game leaves this open because answering it would collapse the scale. If the outer gods are fully aware of individual mortals in the way mortals are aware of each other, they become comprehensible and therefore smaller. If they are entirely unaware, they become mere forces of nature, and the theological weight of the law evaporates. The answer that the law seems to point toward is something in between, that the outer gods have something like awareness, something like intention, but that the resolution of their perception is so different from mortal perception that whether it counts as awareness in any meaningful sense is a question that cannot be answered in mortal terms. The Frenzied Flame might be the most honest about this. Its promise is not that things will be better in the chaos that follows. Its promise is that the question will no longer be askable. No more individual consciousness means no more wondering whether the gods see you. No more separation means no more loneliness in the face of cosmic indifference. The Frenzied Flame offers the one solution that cannot be argued with, which is the dissolution of the being doing the arguing. Every other outer god asks you to continue existing within their framework, to be a worshipper, or a vessel, or a soldier, or a piece of the order they are trying to establish. The Frenzied Flame asks you to stop, to let the question go along with everything else, to find peace not in an answer, but in the end of the asking. That is not wisdom, but it is, in its own terrible way, a coherent response to the situation the lands between finds itself in. A world where the dominant order has shattered, where every alternative order comes with its own divine cost, where the people caught between enormous competing forces have been fighting and dying and losing for so long that the idea of rest, even the rest of dissolution, has genuine appeal. The stars continue to move. Now that Radan no longer holds them back, the rot continues to spread through whatever water table connects Kylid to the underground lakes. The Frenzied Flame continues to press against the underside of wherever the nearest civilization happens to be. The Formless Mother continues to reach her blood across impossible distances toward anyone desperate enough to receive it. The god of death, if there is one, continues to wait for the permanent deaths that the rune of death's release has made possible again, and somewhere in the outer skies, vast and patient and ancient beyond anything the lands between's history can measure, the greater will continues to exist, continues to want what it has always wanted, which is an ordered world under its particular law, governed by its chosen vessel, cycling souls through its system according to its design. The tarnished chose an ending. The world became something. The outer skies remained. Everything else is silence and starlight and the very slow turning of forces too large to name. You said, continue, 2319. Claude responded, the Haligtree and Miquella's unfinished god, the Haligtree and Miquella's unfinished god. There is a location in Elden Ring that feels different from everywhere else in the game. Not harder, though it is hard. Not stranger, though it is strange. It feels unfinished. The Haligtree, Miquella's golden tree grown from his own severed arm, is a place that was meant to become something and did not get there. Walking through it, you are walking through an interrupted miracle. Miquella planted the Haligtree as an alternative to the Erd tree. His intention, as the lore suggests it, was to grow a divine tree that would operate outside the greater will's framework, one that could grant grace and blessing and healing without requiring submission to the Golden Order. He poured himself into it literally, growing it from his own flesh, feeding it with his own Empyrean essence. The Haligtree was not going to be a monument to an existing god. It was going to be the foundation of a new one. The scarlet rot reached it anyway. The rot came to the Haligtree as it came everywhere, patient and indifferent to Miquella's intentions, and the tree that was supposed to be Millennia's sanctuary became instead another site of the god of rot's encroachment. The lower levels of the Haligtree are thick with rot, with the bodies of knights who came to serve Miquella's vision, and instead died in its ruins. And at the top, in Elphael, Malenia waits. She has been sleeping, or something close to sleeping, protecting the Haligtree's most intact section with her presence. Her knights still serve her. The place still has the quality of something sacred, even as the rot eats at its edges. It is a sanctuary that has been compromised but not entirely lost, held together by the will of one person who refuses to let it fall completely. The theological significance of the Haligtree for the outer god framework is considerable. It was an attempt by a mortal, even an Empyrean mortal, to build a divine institution from scratch. Not to channel an existing outer god's power, not to serve an existing order, but to create something genuinely new. The fact that it failed, that it was invaded by the rot and left incomplete when Mohg took Miquella, does not erase what the attempt represents. Miquella believed that an Empyrean with enough power and enough will could establish a divine presence without a patron outer god behind it. He may have been right. The Haligtree was growing. It had followers, a culture, an internal logic. If it had been given more time, if Miquella had not been taken, if the rot had been kept out, something genuinely unprecedented might have emerged there. A new god, born from mortal will rather than cosmic imposition, rooted in a specific place and a specific set of intentions, rather than arrived from the outer skies with a pre-existing agenda. Whether that would have been better than what the outer gods offer is a question the game poses by showing you the ruins of the attempt. The Haligtree's failure is not presented as inevitable, it is presented as tragic, and tragedy requires the possibility of a different outcome. Miquella's needle and the art of sealing gods. We talked about Miquella's needle in the context of the god of rot, but the needle is worth examining as a piece of divine technology rather than simply a plot object. The fact that Miquella could design and create an object capable of suppressing an outer god's influence in a person reveals something significant about the nature of divine influence in this world. Outer gods, as we have established, operate through channels. They reach into the world through vessels, through substances, through altered states of consciousness, through the infrastructure they build or claim. The needle works by interrupting one of those channels. It is, in essence, a physical argument against a divine claim, a crafted object that says to an outer god's influence, not here, not in this body, not right now. That this is possible, that divine influence can be physically blocked by a sufficiently skilled theurgist, is one of the most important things the lore establishes. The outer gods are not omnipotent in the way a maximally powerful god would be. Their power operates through specific mechanisms, and those mechanisms can be understood, studied, and sometimes countered. Miquella understood them well enough to make a counter tool. The blasphemous blade, which is associated with Rykard's pact with the serpent, is another version of this, a weapon that channels divine influence in a specific and controllable direction. The black blade, Malekith's weapon, is the same, a physical object designed to carry and deploy the rune of death in a targeted way. The Elden Ring itself is, at the highest scale, a piece of divine technology, a law encoded in a physical form. What all of this suggests is that the outer gods operate in a world with specific metaphysical rules that can be learned and used by mortals who are clever and powerful enough. The world of Elden Ring is not one where gods are simply beyond mortal comprehension and interference. It is one where the gap between mortal and divine is very large but not infinite, where the right object or the right knowledge or the right act at the right moment can change what a god is able to do in a particular place. This is why Ranni's plan works. It is not simply that she is powerful. It is that she understood the mechanisms well enough to find the gaps. She knew that killing her body before the two fingers could act would put her outside the system. She knew that the Fingerslayer blade could act against the two fingers. She knew that restoring the rune of death to the world through Malekith's defeat would shake the Greater Will's hold on the lands between. She assembled a plan from technical knowledge of how divine influence actually works, rather than trying to fight it with brute force. The lesson of Miquella's needle and Ranni's plan taken together is that the outer gods can be managed by those who understand them. Not defeated in a cosmic sense, not eliminated, but outmaneuvered, sealed, redirected, escaped. The knowledge required is immense and the cost is always high, but the possibility exists. The fingers mourning. There is a quality to the two fingers that is easy to miss because they are presented as authoritative and institutional, and the finger readers who interpret them do so with reverence. But if you sit with the lore long enough, the two fingers start to feel less like confident divine representatives and more like something grief-stricken and diminished. They are withered. They were not always this way. The descriptions and the visual of them suggest something that has been drying out for a long time, something that was once more vital and is now holding on. They went quiet when the Elden Ring shattered, and they have not fully recovered. The finger readers strain to interpret gestures that are becoming more faint and more ambiguous. What would it feel like to be the representative of a divine order that has partially collapsed, to be built for one purpose, which is to communicate the Greater Will's instructions and to shepherd Empyreans toward becoming Elden Lord, and to find that the communication has broken down, that the Empyreans have all either fled or been taken, or are pursuing their own agendas, that the candidate you are supposed to be guiding is a wandering tarnished of unclear origin who may or may not follow your instructions. The two fingers cannot speak in human language, they gesture. They depend on intermediaries, and their intermediaries are doing their best, but are working with increasingly faint signals from an increasingly remote source. The whole relationship between the Greater Will and the lands between, at the time the game takes place, is mediated through a chain of communication that has been degraded at every link. Whether the two fingers experience something like distress at this situation, the lore does not say, but the image of them dried and ancient and gesturing in the dark of Round Table Hold and various churches is one of the more melancholy images in the game when you read it in the context of everything else. They are loyalists of an order that has been shattered. They are still doing their job, but the job has become much harder and the results much less certain, and they have no way to ask for help and no certainty that help is coming. The Elden Lord is a theological office. Becoming Elden Lord, which is the nominal goal of the game, is not just a political title. It is a theological office, a specific role within the Greater Will's system of governance for the lands between. The Elden Lord is the mortal partner of the god, the human face of divine authority, the person who administers the Golden Order's laws within the world, while the god's vessel, the Elden Beast, carries the Elden Ring itself. Godfrey was the first Elden Lord, and his role was military, the conquest and pacification of the lands between under the Golden Order's banner. Radagon, Marika's second husband and her other self, was the second Elden Lord, and his role seems to have been more ecclesiastical, more involved in the internal governance of the Golden Order's institutions. What a new Elden Lord would do, what the office means now that the Elden Ring has been shattered and potentially remade, depends entirely on which ending the player pursues. The Restoration ending, where the Tarnished mends the Elden Ring and becomes Elden Lord in the conventional sense, is essentially a commitment to continue the Greater Will's project. The Tarnished accepts the theological office, accepts its implications, accepts the role of mortal administrator for a cosmic power's presence in the world. It is the most conservative ending, the one that most closely follows what the Two Fingers have been asking for. But even in that ending, the Tarnished Elden Lord is not the same as Godfrey or Radagon. They are tarnished, which the law has established means something specific. They have been outside the system. They have seen the other endings, the other possibilities, even if they chose not to pursue them. Whether a tarnished Elden Lord can truly serve the Greater Will's interests without reservation, or whether their outsider history makes them a different kind of Elden Lord than any who came before, is something the game leaves unresolved. The theological office of Elden Lord is, in the end, a question about relationship with power. Every candidate for the role has to decide whether they are serving the Greater Will, using it, or finding some third option that the role's original designers never anticipated. Godfrey served loyally and was discarded. Marika served and eventually broke. Radagon seems to have served so completely that he became indistinguishable from Marika herself. The Tarnished arrives at the end of all of this history with the full knowledge of what the office has cost its previous holders. Whether that knowledge changes anything is the question every ending is trying to answer. The nomadic merchants and divine marginalization. This might seem like a small thing compared to everything else we have discussed, but the nomadic merchants are one of the more poignant presences in the game. They wander the lands between selling their wares, and their lore is one of quiet tragedy. They were once part of a larger community, a people who lived underground, and something happened to scatter them, to separate them from each other, to reduce them to solitary wandering figures who hum to themselves at night and whose only company is the memory of their community songs. The item descriptions connected to the nomadic merchant suggest that their ancestors lived in a place called the subterranean shunning grounds, the underground area beneath Lendel that contains the Frenzied Flame prescription. In other words, their people lived directly above the Frenzied Flame. Whether they were displaced because of the Frenzied Flame's presence, or whether they had some relationship with it, or whether they simply lived in an underground space that the Golden Order considered too close to a dangerous divine force, and were removed or scattered as a consequence, the lore does not specify clearly. But the geography suggests that the nomadic merchants community was disrupted by the divine politics of the Golden Order managing its relationship with the Frenzied Flame beneath Lendel. They are, in other words, collateral damage of the war between outer gods, people who had a home and a community and a culture, and who lost it not because of anything they did, but because they were living in a theologically inconvenient location. The game does not make a large statement about this. It simply puts them there, wandering, humming, separated, and lets you sit with what that means. The game is full of these smaller casualties, the people of Caelid who survived the rot, the servants of demigods who continued serving after their masters went mad, the soldiers of armies that fought wars they did not start for reasons they did not choose. The outer gods competition produces enormous theological drama at the cosmic level and quiet devastation at the human level, and Elden Ring keeps both in frame simultaneously without letting either one collapse into the other. Rani's doll and the cost of refusal. Rani lives in a doll. This is such a strange and specific detail that it is worth sitting with at length. She killed her own body to escape the greater will's claim on her, and the form she chose to inhabit afterward was a small, blue, porcelain doll with a witch's hat and a slightly unsettling fixed expression. Why a doll? The lore suggests it was a form she could inhabit without the divine attention that a proper Empyrean body would attract. A doll does not look like a god's vessel. A doll does not register to divine senses in the way that a living Empyrean body would. It is camouflage as much as it is habitation, a disguise she has been wearing for so long that it has become simply who she is. But there is another dimension to it. Rani gave up a body to preserve her freedom. She gave up warmth, physical sensation, the ability to be present in the world in the way that embodied beings are present. She can interact with the world, she can speak and move and cast spells, but she is doing it through an interface rather than directly. She is always at one remove from physical reality. The cost of refusing an outer god's claim, in Rani's case, was her body. The cost of the Glomide Queen's refusal to submit was her defeat and imprisonment. The cost of Marika's refusal was her crucifixion inside the Erd tree. The lore consistently shows that refusing divine authority is possible, but never free. There is always a cost, always a wound, always something given up or taken away. Rani's doll body is the most visible of these costs because you see it throughout her questline. She is, in a literal sense, a person who chose freedom over embodiment, who decided that existing as a soul in a porcelain shell was preferable to existing as a whole living person under the greater will's thumb. Whether that was the right choice depends on what you value, and Rani herself never presents it as unambiguously good. She chose it. She does not regret it, but the doll is always there, a reminder of what refusal costs. The age of fracture and the endings. The game gives you several possible endings, and each one is essentially a different answer to the question of what the outer god's competition should produce. It is worth going through them briefly in this context, because the endings are where the game's theological argument becomes most explicit. The Age of Fracture, which is the basic restoration ending, restores the Elden Ring and reinstates the Golden Order. This is the Greater Will's preferred outcome. The Tarnished becomes Elden Lord, the system continues, the other outer gods remain contested or suppressed. It is the status quo ante, or as close to it as the shattered and remade world can achieve. Whether it is good depends on whether you think the Golden Order was good, and the game has given you extensive reasons to be ambivalent about that. The Age of Duskborn, Fia's ending, incorporates destined death back into the Elden Ring. Souls can now die truly and permanently, freed from the recycling system. This is the God of Death's victory condition, or at least a partial one. The world becomes one where death means something again, where the endless recycling of souls through the Erdtree system is replaced with something more final, and therefore Fia argues more honest. The Age of Order, Goldmusk's ending, represents the most extreme pro-greater will outcome. The Golden Order is restored in its most perfect theoretical form, with every flaw and inconsistency corrected according to Goldmusk's obsessive analysis of its doctrine. It is the ending that would most satisfy the greater will's original intentions, which makes it also the ending that most completely erases the complexity and ambiguity that the shattering created. The Age of Stars is Rani's ending, the lunar alternative, the world guided forward by stars and moon, rather than by any of the known outer gods. It is the ending that most explicitly breaks from all existing divine frameworks and attempts something genuinely new. The Lord of Frenzied Flame ending destroys everything, returns the world to undifferentiated chaos, and ends the outer gods' competition by ending the world those gods were competing over. It is the most radical possible outcome, the one that answers the question of which god should win by eliminating the prize. There is also Shabriri and the Frenzied Flame path, and there is the ending that follows from simply defeating the Elden Beast and becoming Elden Lord without following any of the quest lines, which is its own kind of answer. Each ending is a vote, as we said earlier, but thinking about them through the lens of the outer gods makes them feel less like choices between political systems and more like choices between cosmologies. You are not just deciding who governs the lands between, you are deciding which vision of existence should define what comes next. The silence of the outer gods. Throughout all of this, throughout all the lore and all the history and all the competing divine claims, one thing remains constant. The outer gods do not speak in the game, not directly, not in their own voice. The greater will communicates through the two fingers, through grace through the Elden Beast. The Formless Mother communicates through dreams and blood miracles and the mark she left on Moog. The god of rot communicates through the spread of the rot itself, through the way it transforms everything it touches. The Frenzied Flame communicates through the three fingers and through the madness it induces, but none of them speak. There is no cutscene where an outer god addresses you directly. There is no divine voice from the heavens explaining its motivations or its nature. Everything you know about them comes from the traces they leave, from item descriptions and NPC dialogue and environmental design, from the behavior of their followers and the shape of the places they have touched. This is a specific narrative choice and it carries a specific meaning. Gods who speak to you become comprehensible, and comprehensible things become smaller and more manageable. By never giving the outer gods a voice, by keeping them always at one remove, always mediated through human or near-human intermediaries, the game maintains the sense of their scale. You can never fully understand them because you can never hear them directly. You can only observe their effects and try to read backward from the effects to the cause. This is actually quite close to how the game's lore works in general. You never see the Knight of the Black Knives. You never see Marika in her full divine function before the shattering. You never see the Elden Beast arrive from the outer skies. You see the aftermath of all of these things, the world shaped by events you are not present for, and you do the work of reconstruction from the evidence available. The outer gods are the extreme version of this. Every other mystery in the game has at least some direct evidence, some character who was there, some object that carries a clear record. The outer gods are mysteries at such a fundamental level that even the evidence is evidence of evidence, the traces of traces, the shadows of forces that may not even have shadows in any conventional sense. Sitting with that, with the irreducible unknowability of what the outer gods actually are and want and feel, if feeling is something they do, is one of the more philosophically interesting experiences the game offers. It asks you to be comfortable with a level of uncertainty that most stories resolve before they end. It asks you to accept that the forces shaping the world you have spent this entire journey in are finally beyond what can be known. That is not frustrating, or it should not be. It is honest. The world is full of forces that shape it and that resist full comprehension, and a story set in a world where divine forces are explicitly present and explicitly incomprehensible is, in its own way, more realistic about the experience of living under conditions you cannot fully understand than a story where everything is eventually explained. The Tarnished stands at the end of all of this and chooses, not with full knowledge, not with divine guidance that can be fully trusted, not with certainty about what any of the endings will actually produce or whether any of the outer gods' promises are true, just with what they have learned, what they have seen, who they have talked to, and whatever values emerged from all of that. It is, finally, a very human choice in a very inhuman world. And that tension between the human scale of the choice and the cosmic scale of its implications is what makes it feel significant rather than simply conclusive. The outer skies are still there. The stars are moving. The rot is spreading somewhere underground, patient and indifferent and very old. The frenzied flame is pressing against whatever surface is now above it. The Formless Mother is reaching her blood across impossible distances toward whatever desperate soul is willing to receive it. And the tarnished made their choice. The world became something. Whether it was the right something is a question the outer skies will not answer. They never have. They never will. They were there before the question was asked, and they will be there long after the last person capable of asking it is gone. That is the final thing the outer gods teach you, if they teach you anything. Not their names or their natures or their agendas, though you can learn those if you look hard enough. The final thing is simpler and harder than any of that. Scale is not wisdom. Age is not benevolence. Power is not purpose. The outer skies are very large and very old and very powerful. They do not care what you do with what they have given you.